Imagine a world without ice cream. No cones on hot days, no tubs of comfort waiting in the freezer, no late-night spoon-to-carton therapy sessions. That was life for most people before the 1800s. Ice cream did exist in earlier centuries, but it was basically the king of desserts, exclusive, glamorous, and far out of reach, unless you had royal connections and a kitchen staff willing to wrestle giant blocks of ice. For the common folk, frozen desserts might as well have been unicorn food. But then came the 19th century, when ice cream began its grand transformation from elite delicacy to everyday obsession. And make no mistake, it was an obsession. Everyone was suddenly into it, even though nobody fully understood how it worked, why it was safe, spoiler it wasn't, or what it might do to their digestive system. Hello travelers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, why 1800s ice cream was more dangerous than delicious, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Before the 1800s, ice cream was mainly for aristocrats who could afford to keep ice houses stocked all year round. These were not your average ice chests with a tray of cubes. No, these were underground vaults stuffed with blocks of ice harvested in the winter, layered with straw and sawdust to survive until summer. Imagine someone in silk stockings walking down into a dim, chilly cellar thinking, "Ah yes, perfect conditions for dessert." Kings, queens, and wealthy socialites delighted in early recipes that blended milk, cream, sugar, and exotic flavors like orange blossom or pistachio. George Washington was famously fond of ice cream, spending today's equivalent of thousands of dollars on it in a single summer. If your founding father budget goes mostly to frozen treats, you know you're living the sweet life. Thomas Jefferson also had his own recipe for vanilla ice cream, which he reportedly served to dinner guests with great pride. In short, ice cream was the culinary flex of the century, but the 19th century brought industrial change, expanding trade, and most importantly, an expanding middle class. With it came a new desire for luxuries once reserved for nobility. Enter ice cream. What had been a royal delicacy was suddenly being served in urban shops, cafes, and eventually from carts on the street. By the mid-1800s, ice cream had gone viral. Except the only sharing involved was spoon to mouth. Ice cream parlors began springing up in cities like London, Paris, and New York. These were social spaces as much as dining ones. Victorian couples went for ice cream the way modern teenagers go for coffee. You could sit in a parlor, order a fancy dish of frozen cream with fruit or syrup, and bask in the feeling that you were part of the fashionable crowd. But what really pushed ice cream from parlor luxury to street corner treat was the rise of vendors. Immigrants in particular turned ice cream vending into a booming trade. In London, Italian street sellers nicknamed hokey pokey men after their cries of "ecco un poco," "here's a little," peddled small servings of ice cream wrapped in wax paper. In New York, vendors sold penny licks, tiny glasses filled with a scoop, cheap enough for working families. For one precious penny, anyone could enjoy a taste of luxury. Never mind that the serving glasses were reused endlessly without much washing. But don't worry. That's a horror story for later. Why did ice cream take off with such force? Because it was magic in a dish. Imagine living in an era before refrigeration, when summer heat was relentless and refreshment meant tepid water or lukewarm beer. Then, suddenly, someone hands you a spoonful of sweet, cold cream flavored with vanilla or lemon. It wasn't just food, it was sorcery. There was also the allure of novelty. Ice cream wasn't just tasty, it was unusual. Food in the 1800s was often bland, heavy, or boiled into submission. A cold, creamy dessert with a hint of exotic flavoring must have seemed like a glimpse of heaven, or at least a vacation from cabbage stew. No wonder people flocked to it despite the risks. Even newspapers and magazines of the time reflected the craze. Recipes were shared, ice cream machines were advertised, and people bragged about their latest frozen experiments. If social media had existed, entire feeds would have been devoted to poorly lit, slightly melted ice cream scoops with captions like "feeling fancy." By the mid-19th century, ice cream had spread far beyond European parlors. In America, immigrants popularized street vending, while wealthier families ordered extravagant frozen desserts for dinner parties. An 1870s cookbook might contain dozens of ice cream variations, everything from chocolate to pineapple. Ice cream had become so trendy that even political campaigns used it. At one rally, voters were bribed with free scoops to secure their support. Forget promises of change, offer vanilla and you're set. By the 1880s, ice cream was no longer an occasional luxury but a cultural staple. It appeared at weddings, fairs, and family gatherings. It was a reward for children, a romantic date, and a patriotic treat. In short, it was everywhere. Of course, nobody was stopping to ask whether the milk was fresh, the ice was clean, or the food coloring was toxic. But that's not what this chapter is about. For now, picture the 19th century as the great age of ice cream mania, when the dessert stopped being a royal indulgence and became everyone's guilty pleasure. It was fun, addictive, and occasionally questionable. But the key point is this: by the end of the century, ice cream was firmly established as the dessert of the people. Dangerous? Yes. Delicious? Absolutely. And that's why in the 1800s the phrase "I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream" might have had a little too much truth to it. If you were going to make ice cream in the 1800s, you needed one crucial ingredient that wasn't sugar, milk, or eggs. You needed ice, and that was where the dream of a refreshing summer treat collided headfirst with the very real hazards of 19th century food culture. Today, we take for granted that our freezer churns out cubes of clean, tasteless, perfectly frozen water at the push of a button. Back then, ice had to be hacked out of lakes, rivers, and ponds in the winter, stored in giant underground houses packed with straw, and slowly carved away through the summer. The problem? Nature's ice supply was not exactly the pristine bottled water crystal we picture when we think of frozen freshness. It was more like nature's frozen soup. Rivers were convenient sources of ice, but they were also convenient dumping grounds for waste. Cities tossed sewage, animal carcasses, and every imaginable form of refuse into the same water they harvested for ice. In fact, some sources described blocks of ice pulled from waterways as streaked with brown, green, and mysterious floating matter. It wasn't just frozen water, it was a frozen time capsule of everything your neighbors didn't want anymore. If you were unlucky enough, your ice cream's special ingredient might include traces of manure or industrial chemicals. That's right, your refreshing scoop might include a bonus flavor, pond scum. Even when harvested from cleaner-looking lakes, the ice wasn't safe. The cutting process itself was hardly sterile. Men in muddy boots stomped across frozen lakes, hacking away with saws and axes, and hauling out massive blocks with ropes. Imagine a construction site where the building material happens to be what people plan to eat later. Once the blocks were dragged ashore, they were loaded onto sledges or wagons, often landing in piles of dirt, hay, or whatever else happened to be lying around. If you're picturing a pristine supply chain, erase that thought. The 19th century ice industry was closer to a free-for-all scavenger hunt in freezing temperatures. Storage was another disaster waiting to happen. Ice houses, those underground or barn-like buildings packed to the rafters with blocks of ice, were essentially giant fridges that had never heard of sanitation standards. Straw, sawdust, and even old rags were used as insulation. These materials kept the ice from melting too fast, but they also leaked dust, mold, and bacteria onto the blocks themselves. By the time an ice dealer hacked off a chunk to sell to an ice cream vendor, it was less crystal clear and more mystery grey. Let's just say nobody was Instagramming their ice supply. Then came the vendors. Ice was a booming business in the 1800s, and shady dealers were everywhere. The demand was enormous. Households needed ice for food storage, hospitals needed it to cool patients, and ice cream makers needed it to keep their product solid. That meant suppliers could get away with selling almost anything. Some cut costs by reusing half-melted ice scooped off the floor of ice houses. Others mixed in smaller, dirty chunks from questionable sources, and passed them off as premium. By the time this ice reached an ice cream churn, it had lived a hard, filthy life. And when your dessert depended on being churned around a tub packed with ice and salt, every impurity in that ice had a chance to mingle with your frozen treat. What made the whole situation worse was that nobody really understood germs yet. The average 19th century customer didn't see dirty ice as a problem because the filth was frozen solid. It looked hard, cold, and therefore safe. If it doesn't move, it can't hurt you, seemed to be the logic. Spoiler alert, wrong. Freezing might have slowed down some bacteria, but it certainly didn't eliminate them. Every chip of ice tucked against a tin of custard cream was a microbial party waiting to thaw inside your stomach. And the irony was brutal. Ice was supposed to symbolize freshness and health. Doctors even recommended ice for fevers or digestive troubles. It was thought to cool the system and balance the body's humors. So when you were sweating through a hot summer in London or New York, grabbing a scoop of ice cream felt like a wise, even medicinal choice. In reality, you were gambling with whatever upstream neighbor had dumped into the river 3 months earlier. The good news? Your fever might go down. The bad news? A new one was about to start. The scale of this ice trade was massive. By the mid-1800s, entrepreneurs were shipping blocks of ice hundreds of miles, even across oceans. American businessman Frederick Tudor, known as the Ice King, made a fortune exporting New England lake ice to places as far as the Caribbean and India. Imagine entire ships packed with frozen ponds sailing across the tropics. Tudor became a legend for bringing the luxury of cool to hot climates. But as impressive as it was to haul frozen water to Havana or Calcutta, the fundamental issue remained that ice wasn't clean. It was exotic filth, imported at great cost, wrapped in sawdust, and served as sophistication. The elite sipped their chilled drinks with pride, unaware their high society taste might come with an extra crunch of microbes. This is what made 19th century ice cream such a paradox. The ingredient that made it possible, the very thing that transformed cream into something magical, was also the thing most likely to harm you. Ice didn't just chill your dessert, it carried the city's waste directly into your digestive system. And yet people couldn't resist. On sweltering afternoons when streets reeked of horse manure and smoke, nothing compared to a cold spoonful of ice cream. It was worth the gamble. The story of ice in the 1800s is less about dessert and more about humanity's endless ability to take a good idea and overlook the glaring problems. People wanted cold treats so badly they were willing to trust ice from polluted rivers, shady dealers, and dusty ice houses. The result was a dessert that looked innocent, tasted delightful, and sometimes left you in bed regretting every bite. If you lived in a bustling 19th century city, there was one sound that could make children run faster than the church bells on Sunday: the cries of the ice cream vendors. They pushed their carts or wheeled barrows through crowded streets, calling out in sing-song voices, promising a taste of cold paradise for just a penny. It was the kind of marketing that worked every time. Unfortunately, so did the germs, because as delightful as the thought of street corner ice cream may sound, the reality was that buying a scoop from one of these vendors was like licking the inside of a chimney and calling it dessert. Let's start with the carts themselves. A modern food truck might undergo regular inspections, require permits, and display shiny stainless steel equipment. A 19th century ice cream cart, on the other hand, was more likely a wooden box on wheels with a tin container for the product and zero concern for cleanliness. These carts trundled through city streets filled with mud, manure, coal smoke, and the occasional dead rat. When the vendor parked, the wheels were often surrounded by puddles of horse urine, and yet children crowded around, pennies clutched in hand, waiting eagerly for their treat. Nothing says summer joy like ice cream served inches away from a steaming pile left by the local carriage horse. Then came the matter of utensils. Street vendors typically served their ice cream in little glasses known as penny licks. These were small, thick-bottomed tumblers designed to make the portion look larger than it actually was. Customers would pay their penny, lick the ice cream out of the glass, and hand it right back to the vendor, who would promptly refill it for the next customer. Washing between uses? Only if you count wiping the rim with a dirty rag. Imagine dozens of mouths in one afternoon sharing the same small glass, passing along not just sugar and cream, but whatever cough, cold, or mysterious rash the last person had. It was less one scoop each, and more one scoop for all of humanity. The spoons weren't much better. Vendors often carried a few tin spoons that rotated endlessly between customers. A quick dip in a bucket of tepid water was considered sanitizing. This bucket, of course, was rarely emptied until the end of the day, meaning by evening it resembled a broth of milk residue, street dust, and fly corpses. Every scoop was a community project, and speaking of flies, they were the true shareholders in the penny ice cream business. Carts swarmed with them, sweet cream was irresistible, and the vendors didn't exactly shoo them away. Flies hopped from scoop to scoop, pausing to sample the goods before moving on to their next meal, which could easily be the carcass of a dead dog in the alley. Customers, meanwhile, thought nothing of it. A little extra protein, right? City soot added another layer of flavor. Streets were filled with coal smoke from factories and chimneys, along with dust kicked up by horses and wagons. Open-air ice cream was a perfect landing pad. As vendors scooped into their tins, fine black particles sprinkled into the mix. One writer in the late 1800s complained that street ice cream always seemed to come with a hint of grit, though nobody complained too loudly because, well, it was still cold and sweet. Of course, hygiene wasn't the only shady part of the business. Some vendors cut corners in ways that made their products questionable even before flies and soot joined in. There are accounts of sellers stretching their ice cream supply by mixing in mashed turnips or thickened flour. Add enough sugar, and most children wouldn't notice they were licking what amounted to frozen vegetable paste. You might call it the original plant-based alternative, except this one came with digestive regret. Still, penny ice cream was wildly popular. For many working-class families, it was the only luxury they could afford. Children who never tasted exotic fruits or elaborate pastries could still run to the corner and enjoy the thrill of something cold and sweet. That thrill was powerful enough to overshadow the obvious risks. Parents knew the glasses weren't washed, but what could you do? A penny treat bought a half hour of happiness for your child, and in neighborhoods where happiness was scarce, that was worth it. Public health officials eventually noticed that penny licks were basically bacteria bombs. Outbreaks of diseases like tuberculosis and cholera were often traced back to these shared glasses. Reformers urged for single-use cups or cones, but vendors resisted because it was cheaper to keep reusing the glass. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when edible cones and disposable cups became widespread, that the penny lick finally disappeared. By then, it had left behind a trail of memories and probably more than a few infections. What makes this story fascinating is the contrast between appearance and reality. To the child holding a penny lick in 1870, ice cream was joy incarnate, cold, sweet, colorful. To the historian looking back, it was an open invitation to disease. Both are true. The delight of street ice cream lay in its accessibility. It took a food once reserved for elites and made it part of ordinary life. But that accessibility came at a cost, measured in coughs, fevers, and stomach aches. So next time you buy a scoop from a clean stainless steel counter and walk away with a disposable spoon, take a moment to thank modern hygiene. Your ice cream no longer comes with free soot sprinkles, mystery rashes, or horse manure dust. And while it might not cost a penny anymore, it also doesn't require you to share a glass with a stranger who just sneezed into it. That's what we call progress. If there was one ingredient that gave ice cream its soul in the 1800s, it was milk. Sweet, creamy, velvety milk, the foundation of every churn, the base that turned sugar and flavoring into something magical. Without milk, ice cream was just flavored ice. With milk, it became a soft, luscious dream in a cup. The problem? That dream often came with nightmares attached, because 19th century milk was one of the most treacherous foods you could consume. It spoiled quickly, it was tampered with constantly, and it turned what should have been a summer delight into a toxic gamble. At least when modern ice cream makes you bloated, it isn't because it's 50% plaster. The first problem was simply the lack of refrigeration. Today, milk is whisked from cow to carton in carefully controlled refrigerated conditions. In the 1800s, milk left the cow warm, was sloshed into wooden buckets, poured into open pails, hauled through city streets, and left to sit for hours or even days before it ever touched an ice cream churn. In summer heat, that process was basically an incubator for bacteria. Milk soured quickly, but rather than toss it out, many sellers shrugged and sold it anyway. A hint of vanilla or a heap of sugar in ice cream covered a multitude of sins. If your cone tasted a little tangy, it wasn't because the vendor was experimenting with yogurt. It was because you were halfway to food poisoning, but spoiled milk was just the beginning. Far worse was the deliberate adulteration that became a hallmark of the 19th century dairy trade. Demand for milk was high, especially in booming industrial cities, and unscrupulous suppliers realized they could stretch their product and their profits by watering it down. Of course, watery milk looked suspiciously thin, so sellers got creative. They added chalk to make it white again. They mixed in plaster of Paris to thicken it. They stirred in flour, starch, or even mashed up brains from slaughterhouses to mimic the consistency of cream. Yes, you read that correctly, brains. Nothing says refreshing treat like a scoop of vanilla custard fortified with bonus neurology. One of the most infamous scandals was the rise of swill milk. In cities like New York, cows were kept in appalling urban dairies, often attached to distilleries. The cows were fed the hot, fermented mash left over from whiskey production. This diet produced sickly, undernourished animals whose milk was thin, bluish, and far from wholesome. To disguise its poor quality, dairymen doctored it with all the tricks of the trade: chalk, starch, molasses, plaster, and sold it by the bucketful to eager families and ice cream makers. The result? Milk that looked creamy but carried a cocktail of disease and filth. Newspapers eventually exposed swill milk as a killer of children, but by then it had already done its damage. Imagine that hidden inside your cone on a summer's day. If that wasn't bad enough, there were even accounts of preservatives being added to milk to keep it fresh. Some vendors used formaldehyde. Yes, the same chemical used to embalm bodies. A dash of it could keep milk from spoiling just long enough to sell, but at a cost to anyone who drank it. Your ice cream might have tasted perfectly fine while it quietly pickled your insides. The effect on ice cream was disastrous. Milk was the heart of the recipe. But when that heart was rotten, the whole dessert turned dangerous. Children, especially, were the biggest victims. A penny lick of ice cream seemed like an innocent indulgence, but behind the sweetness was spoiled milk, stretched with water, laced with chalk, and sometimes embalmed with chemicals. Ice cream became a Trojan horse for illness, looking delightful on the outside but carrying dysentery, cholera, and even tuberculosis straight into eager mouths. Parents thought they were treating their children. Instead, they were sending them into microbial combat, armed only with a tiny spoon. The tragedy of it all was how normalized this became. Everyone knew milk spoiled quickly, but instead of tackling the problem at the root, improving sanitation, refrigeration, or regulation, the default solution was to mask it, add more sugar, stir in some color, hide the curdling under fruit syrup. Ice cream wasn't just dessert, it was performance art. Vendors weren't just selling frozen cream, they were selling the illusion that milk was fine, even when it had spent 3 days fermenting in the back of a cart under the sun, and people wanted to believe. The public adored milk-based foods, especially ice cream, which seemed nourishing as well as delightful. Doctors sometimes even recommended ice cream for invalids, believing the milk gave strength. Imagine being handed a bowl of medicinal ice cream in a hospital, meant to perk you up, only to discover the main ingredient had been swimming with bacteria since last Tuesday. It was the kind of treatment that probably made patients sicker than their original condition. The truth is, milk in the 1800s was a gamble whether you were pouring it on your porridge or freezing it into dessert. The lack of refrigeration made spoilage inevitable, and the rampant adulteration made corruption standard practice. Combined, they created a perfect storm of hidden dangers for anyone craving a simple scoop, and yet people lined up anyway. Because when you're hot, tired, and craving something sweet, your first thought isn't, "Is this milk thickened with chalk dust?" It's, "Please just give me the ice cream." What makes this part of the story so fascinating is how it highlights the gap between perception and reality. Milk symbolized purity, nourishment, and health. It was supposed to be the most wholesome of foods. But in the 19th century, the very thing that made ice cream creamy and irresistible also made it one of the riskiest desserts around. Every spoonful was a roll of the dice. So the next time you grumble about paying extra for organic, grass-fed dairy in your modern gelato, remember this: at least it's not half plaster, half whiskey mash, with a formaldehyde chaser. In the 1800s, you didn't need sprinkles to make your ice cream dangerous. The milk did all the work. The 19th century was a time of culinary optimism. People were excited about food innovations, from canned goods to ice cream, and many recipes grew more elaborate with the addition of eggs. Custard-based ice creams, rich, velvety, and smooth, quickly became the gold standard for anyone who wanted to show off their refinement. But here's the catch: the golden yolks that gave ice cream its luscious texture also carried hidden dangers. Eggs were the silent accomplice in ice cream's dark history, and in the 1800s, every spoonful came with the risk of a very unpleasant afterparty. Let's start with the basics. Refrigeration was either non-existent or highly unreliable. That meant eggs didn't enjoy the cozy protection of a modern fridge. Instead, they were stacked in baskets, stored in pantries, or carted to markets in open air. A warm summer's day could turn a fresh egg into a biological time bomb faster than you could say gelato. And unlike today, when health inspectors swoop in if a restaurant so much as sneezes in the direction of a raw egg, nobody in the 19th century suspected eggs could harbor invisible killers. That invisible killer was salmonella, though nobody in the 1800s knew the name. In fact, it wasn't until the late 19th century that scientists began linking foodborne illness to microscopic organisms. Before that, illness was often blamed on vague miasmas, bad air, or unlucky humors. So when someone fell violently ill after an ice cream social, the general consensus might be that they had been out in the sun too long, or that their digestion was simply weak. In truth, they had just been served a raw egg custard chilled with pond ice, garnished with typhoid for flavor. The way eggs were incorporated into ice cream didn't help matters. Custard recipes often called for mixing eggs into cream and sugar, then heating them just enough to thicken the mixture. But without reliable thermometers or standardized recipes, just enough was a dangerously vague instruction. Too little heat, and the bacteria lounged comfortably in the custard, multiplying as it cooled. Too much heat, and the custard curdled into sweet scrambled eggs. Since no one wanted to ruin their dessert, cooks erred on the side of undercooking. Voila, an elegant salmonella delivery system. Now, you might think people would notice when something tasted off. Spoiled eggs, after all, have a distinct aroma. But remember, sugar is powerful. A heavy hand with sugar and cream could mask the subtle funk of an egg that had passed its prime. Besides, the 19th century palate was accustomed to stronger, less refined flavors than ours. People were used to drinking milk that wasn't exactly fresh, and eating meats that would send us running to Yelp to file a complaint. A slightly questionable egg, hardly worth mentioning. The other issue was the scale of preparation. Ice cream wasn't just made in genteel kitchens. It was also churned out in bulk for large gatherings, church socials, political rallies, and public celebrations. In these cases, dozens of eggs might be cracked into a single giant vat of custard. If just one of those eggs was contaminated, the entire batch became a vehicle of mass destruction. Imagine an entire picnic of cheerful families, happily spooning up the rich, silky dessert, only to spend the next 2 days regretting their life choices. It's the Victorian version of a food poisoning outbreak at a modern buffet, except nobody knew what hit them. Even more unsettling, eggs weren't always fresh to begin with. The supply chain of the 19th century wasn't built for speed. Eggs might have traveled for days or even weeks from farm to market. Without refrigeration, sellers sometimes used dubious preservation tricks. Coating eggs in lard or lime water was a common method to extend shelf life. But this didn't stop bacteria from thriving inside. All it really did was make a bad egg look deceptively good. To the unsuspecting ice cream maker, that egg seemed fine. To the unlucky eater, it was anything but. The irony is that eggs were meant to elevate ice cream, to make it more luxurious and smooth. For the wealthy, custard-based ice cream was a status symbol, proof that you had the means to buy quality ingredients and the leisure to enjoy them. Yet this very refinement increased the risk. The richer the ice cream, the higher the chance it would also double as a laxative, except one with far more catastrophic consequences. And here's where the humor practically writes itself. In the 1800s, eggs weren't just part of breakfast, they were part of your funeral plan. You could sit down to enjoy a summer treat, savoring the thick, velvety custard, and within hours find yourself locked in mortal combat with your digestive system. Today's warnings about raw cookie dough seem positively quaint by comparison. At least modern cookie dough isn't stored next to a horse trough. So while eggs gave 19th century ice cream its luxurious edge, they also made each bite a dangerous gamble. Would it be creamy bliss, or an all-night date with dysentery? No one knew. The only certainty was that ice cream in the 1800s wasn't just about indulgence, it was about risk. And like any good gamble, the house, or in this case the bacteria, usually won. By the mid-19th century, ice cream had become more than just a dessert. It was a spectacle. Vendors weren't just selling a cold, sweet treat. They were selling an experience, a performance, a display of decadence you could lick. But the problem was, nature's palate is rather limited when it comes to frozen dairy. Cream gives you white, add chocolate, and you get brown. Toss in strawberries, you might manage a faint pink. And that was simply not enough for vendors trying to catch the attention of city crowds with pennies to spend and eyes to impress. Enter artificial coloring. It wasn't the safe food-grade dye we casually stir into cake batter today. No, in the 1800s, ice cream makers raided the chemist's shelf, and what they found there was, well, let's just say it belonged more in a painter's workshop than in a dessert parlor. Bright green pistachio. That glow came courtesy of copper salts or even arsenic compounds. Brilliant yellow lemon. That was courtesy of lead chromate, a substance that made chemists nervous to even handle, let alone swallow. A scoop of violet. Aniline dyes derived from coal tar gave it that vibrant punch. The truth was, the more beautiful your ice cream looked, the more likely it was plotting your death. And people loved it. They couldn't resist. Just as modern consumers might choose the most photogenic milkshake with rainbow sprinkles and neon whipped cream, Victorians were drawn to ice cream that seemed almost too dazzling to be real, which, of course, was exactly the problem. It wasn't real. Those bright, eye-popping colors were advertisements for poison in disguise. The logic of the vendors wasn't entirely irrational. After all, in crowded marketplaces where a dozen carts might be selling nearly identical treats, presentation was everything. The brighter your lemon ice, the more it looked like sunshine in a cup. The greener your pistachio, the more it whispered of luxury and exotic imports. And so the competition became less about taste and more about theatrics. The winner wasn't necessarily the cart with the best flavor, but the one with the loudest shade of green. The results were predictably disastrous. Medical records and newspapers from the period document outbreaks of sudden illness tied to vividly colored desserts. One green-dyed sweet might cause stomach cramps, another could induce vomiting and hallucinations, some, if generously enhanced, could even kill. But of course the connection wasn't always obvious. If you keeled over a few hours after enjoying your ice cream, it might be blamed on bad milk, contaminated water, or just the mysterious hand of fate. Nobody rushed to accuse the beautiful jewel-toned treat, because how could something so lovely be lethal? This irony didn't go unnoticed by the few early voices of food safety reform. Health campaigners began to publish pamphlets warning the public of the dangers of artificial dyes, describing ice cream as a chemical minefield, masquerading as refreshment. But reform was slow. Vendors dismissed such warnings as alarmist nonsense, while consumers shrugged and licked another spoonful. It's hard to convince people that something deadly is also delicious, especially when they're holding it in their hands on a hot summer's day. One particularly notorious example was emerald green, a pigment made from copper acetoarsenite. It was prized for its stunning, almost otherworldly brilliance. Painters adored it, decorators adored it, and unfortunately ice cream makers adored it too. The small detail that it contained arsenic, a substance well known for being one of history's favorite poisons, did little to dampen enthusiasm. Customers who enjoyed a scoop of emerald green pistachio might find themselves experiencing a thrilling new sensation: internal organ failure. It's easy to laugh at the ignorance of the past, but in fairness, food science was still in its infancy. The idea that a dash of something so pretty could harm you wasn't widely understood. After all, if it could be purchased at the local chemist, surely it was safe, and if customers were lining up again and again, then the product couldn't possibly be as dangerous as a few cranky doctors claimed. Besides, there was a cultural preference for spectacle. The Victorians loved excess, from garish wallpapers to flamboyant fashion. Why should their desserts be any different? Still, the combination of chemicals and cream slowly gained notoriety. Cases of summer stomach, as they were sometimes called, became too frequent to ignore. Physicians began to notice patterns between patients who had recently indulged in vividly colored sweets and sudden gastrointestinal collapse. By the late 19th century, some cities began regulating the use of certain dyes, though enforcement was patchy at best. It wasn't until the early 20th century that governments started seriously restricting which pigments could go in food, and even then, it was an uphill battle. But for much of the 1800s, eating brightly colored ice cream was essentially a lottery ticket for digestive disaster. You could enjoy a perfectly harmless scoop, or you could spend the next few days regretting your life choices in close proximity to a chamber pot. The choice was yours, though realistically, most people didn't think they were choosing at all. They thought they were simply indulging in the frozen equivalent of a rainbow, not realizing that the rainbow was laced with heavy metals. So yes, the good news was that your ice cream was Instagrammable before cameras even existed. The bad news was that your vibrant pistachio could double as a rat poison. When you think about it, that makes today's fluorescent blue bubblegum ice cream seem almost wholesome by comparison. At least it only stains your tongue, not your kidneys. If you think sugar today is bad for you because it might give you cavities or inspire a dentist to scold you, the 1800s version of sugar would make you beg for nothing sweeter than plain bread. At least bread rarely tried to double as a chemical weapon. Sugar in the 19th century was not the neatly refined white granules you find in modern kitchens. It was a gamble. Every spoonful was essentially a chemistry experiment, unlabeled, untested, and definitely not approved by any health authority. First, let's start with the obvious. Sugar was expensive and in high demand. Britain, the United States, and much of Europe were buzzing with tea drinkers, cake bakers, and yes, ice cream vendors, who all needed a steady supply of sweetness. The trouble was that the refining process wasn't always perfect. Sugar came packed in loaves or cones and had to be chipped off and ground down before use. Along the way, contaminants often hitched a ride. Dust, dirt, and even sand could make their way in, leaving you with dessert that crunched in ways it absolutely shouldn't. Nothing says romantic summer stroll with ice cream like biting into what feels suspiciously like beach pebbles. But the real horror came not from dirt, but from deliberate adulteration. Unscrupulous sellers frequently stretched their supply with substances that looked like sugar, but cost far less. Chalk was a favorite. It gave sugar the bright whiteness customers associated with purity. Bone dust sometimes made an appearance too, which is less of a culinary choice and more of a ghost story. In darker cases, sugar was cut with alum, plaster, or even powdered lime. Imagine your cone sprinkled not with rainbow jimmies but with the remnants of a construction site. And let's not forget chemicals that were more than just disgusting, they were lethal. Lead compounds sometimes entered the mix, either from the refining process or from intentional use as a whitening agent. Eating lead-laced sugar didn't just give you a tummy ache. It could give you chronic poisoning, neurological damage, and a slow, painful decline. Then there were cases where arsenic found its way into sugar supplies, whether through cross-contamination in factories or sheer negligence. So when you sweetened your tea or bit into your ice cream, you might not just be indulging, you might be rehearsing your death scene. On top of this, the storage and shipping of sugar were disasters waiting to happen. Long journeys meant sugar sacks sitting in damp ship holds, vulnerable to mold, mildew, and the occasional rat infestation. Vendors weren't in the habit of discarding spoiled stock. They simply sold it as is, trusting that once buried in cream, eggs, and flavorings, no one would notice. Ice cream became less of a dessert and more of a petri dish, one scoop away from disaster. The irony is that people thought sugar itself was wholesome. It was linked to progress, wealth, and luxury. A child licking a candy stick was seen as innocent joy, not as someone dabbling in low-level chemical warfare. No one questioned why their sugar sometimes looked a bit grey, or why it clumped into strange, chalky lumps. They just stirred it into their custards, froze it into ice cream, and hoped for the best. After all, when the alternative was bitter coffee or bland porridge, taking your chances with adulterated sugar felt almost reasonable. Of course, sugar wasn't just for flavor, it was also a preservative. Ice cream vendors relied on it to mask the sourness of spoiled milk or the odd aftertaste of eggs past their prime. In that sense, sugar was the ultimate co-conspirator in dessert crime. It didn't just make your ice cream sweet, it covered up the warning signs that it might kill you. Sweetness became the camouflage of decay, an edible disguise for ingredients that should never have seen the inside of a mixing bowl. So when you picture a 19th century ice cream cone, don't imagine a clean scoop of vanilla on a sunny day. Picture a fragile balance of chalk, plaster, and lead held together by melting cream. Your treat wasn't just empty calories, it was calories with ambition, calories auditioning for the role of silent assassin. And yet, people kept eating it. Because humans, it turns out, will risk almost anything for dessert. Picture yourself strolling into an ice cream parlor in the mid-1800s, eager for a cool scoop to beat the summer heat. The place is lively, bustling with laughter, children licking cones, and young couples sharing sundaes. It all looks charming enough, until you realize you've walked into the equivalent of a biological battleground. Because before germ theory gained traction, nobody saw the problem with hundreds of people sticking their mouths on the same spoons, sipping from the same glasses, and handling the same sticky ladles dipped over and over again into communal tubs. What could possibly go wrong? Well, let's just say your dessert might come with a side of tuberculosis, diphtheria, or typhoid fever. The concept of sharing was central to ice cream culture in the 19th century, but not in the wholesome family values way it's sometimes painted. Ice cream parlors often served their treats in reusable glass cups, pewter bowls, or tin dishes. After a customer finished, the dish was given the quickest of rinses, if that. Many vendors simply wiped it out with a rag and handed it to the next patron. Spoons were even worse. The same tarnished metal spoons might pass through dozens of mouths in a single afternoon. To the modern eye, it looks less like a dessert service and more like a roulette wheel of infection. Every bite was a spin of the wheel, except the jackpot was consumption. Now, tuberculosis, commonly known as consumption, wasn't just a minor nuisance. It was the slow wasting disease of the century. Patients coughed blood, lost weight, and often died painfully after years of decline. Imagine handing a communal spoon to someone with a hacking cough, and then passing it along to a giggling child seconds later. That was business as usual. And it wasn't only TB. Before the widespread acceptance of germ theory, people didn't connect dirty spoons with invisible pathogens. A spoon was just a spoon. If it still vaguely resembled cutlery after being dunked in a bucket of grey rinse water, it was good to go. It gets even more appetizing. Ice cream parlors were often dimly lit and smoky, not the sparkling sanitized eateries we imagine today. Flies hovered over open containers, and the air was filled with a cocktail of soot, tobacco smoke, and whatever wafted in from the street. Add to that the communal handling of dishes, and ice cream shops became incubators for respiratory diseases. Families flocked to these establishments, unknowingly treating themselves to a shared experience in more ways than one. If ice cream was a social glue, it was also the paste that stuck germs from one household to another. The street vendors weren't much better. Those with carts had only so much water to spare, and it wasn't fresh mountain spring water. It was more likely a sloshing pail of tepid liquid used again and again. A spoon might be cleaned with a dip in this communal bath, and a quick wipe on the vendor's apron. Think of it as a pre-industrial dishwasher, with a 100% guarantee of cross-contamination. If you were lucky, you just got the lingering taste of last customer's raspberry syrup. If unlucky, you got whatever disease they coughed up that morning. The problem was compounded by the fact that germ theory was still controversial until the late 19th century. Many physicians still believed in miasma, the idea that diseases spread through bad air and not through direct person-to-person contamination. So while someone with an infectious cough leaning over a bowl of communal strawberry ice might seem obviously dangerous to us, to them it was just bad manners, not a health hazard. This blind spot allowed diseases to spread unchecked, making parlors and carts hotspots for outbreaks. Some cities even suspected ice cream parlors of fueling epidemics. But since the concept of microbes was still new, evidence was hard to pin down. But let's not overlook the cultural side. Eating ice cream was a social event, often meant to bring people together. Couples courted over shared dishes, children crowded around big tubs, and families passed bites from one person's spoon to another's mouth. What we see as unhygienic, they saw as intimacy. Unfortunately, it also meant intimacy with every germ their neighbor carried. In many ways, ice cream was the 19th century equivalent of shaking hands during flu season, except with more dairy and a lot more risk of catching something fatal. This situation paints the perfect irony. Ice cream, the treat meant to refresh and delight, also turned into a hub of microbial mischief. People gathered to escape the heat, but in doing so they inadvertently built a community not just of friends but of pathogens. Every cough, every shared sip, and every try a bite of mine carried with it unseen passengers. To indulge in a sundae was to enter into an unspoken contract. You weren't just buying dessert, you were buying a share of everyone else's germs that day. And here's where the humor practically writes itself. Modern people worry about double dipping at parties, fretting if someone dunks their chip twice in the salsa. But in the 1800s, double dipping wasn't just accepted, it was industrialized. Whole neighborhoods shared the same dessert spoons over and over. Nothing said summer treat like a scoop of ice cream garnished with tuberculosis, sprinkled lightly with diphtheria, and washed down with typhoid fever. Truly, the era of the tuberculosis sundae. In the 1800s, ice cream wasn't just a dessert, it was a status symbol. And like all things dripping with sugar and social meaning, it told you more about where someone sat in society's pecking order than about what was actually in the bowl. Ice cream divided the world into two camps: the elite, who licked their spoons in glittering parlors, and the masses, who bought scoops on the street, gambling with their health every time they heard a vendor ring his bell. For the wealthy, ice cream was the cherry, sometimes literally on top of a life padded with privilege. They had ice houses, sometimes entire underground chambers filled with blocks of river ice insulated with sawdust or straw. This wasn't just about having cold treats in summer. Owning an ice house was the 19th century equivalent of flexing a Lamborghini in your driveway. Ice meant status. Ice cream meant luxury, and luxury meant you got to eat it off porcelain dishes with silver spoons rather than out of a chipped glass that had just been wiped on the vendor's apron. Recipes for the upper classes called for imported flavorings like vanilla from the tropics or citrus from the Mediterranean. Instead of chalk-thickened milk or chemically dyed pistachio, the rich indulged in smooth custards flavored with actual fruit, nuts, and chocolate. When Queen Victoria's household served ice cream at state banquets, it arrived sculpted into swans, castles, and other shapes so elaborate you half expected them to file their own taxes. Ice cream wasn't just food, it was edible architecture. But that's only half the story. because while aristocrats spooned delicately at their fancy confections, the working poor ate their ice cream with the same desperation they ate everything else with luck, with hunger, and without guarantees. Street vendors sold scoops for pennies, usually in reused glasses that were passed from hand to hand like a communal chalice. You'd finish your portion, hand the glass back, and it went straight into circulation for the next customer. Sanitation wasn't even an afterthought. It wasn't a thought at all. The ingredients were just as precarious. While elite families had access to dairies that at least tried to keep milk fresh, the working class got whatever liquid resembled milk by the time it reached the city. This often meant swill milk, watered down and bulked up with anything white, chalk, plaster, starch, sometimes even formaldehyde. Add sugar that might have been cut with lime or alum. Toss in coloring agents laced with copper or arsenic, and suddenly your cheap treat looked more like a chemistry experiment than a dessert. Class wasn't just about quality, though. It was about survival odds. A wealthy child eating ice cream in a London townhouse might suffer a sugar rush. A poor child eating ice cream from a street cart might suffer cholera. In fact, newspapers sometimes reported outbreaks linked directly to contaminated batches sold by vendors. Yet the demand never waned. Ice cream was affordable joy, a frozen luxury for those who had little else to brighten their days. And if the price was a bit of lead poisoning or tuberculosis, well, life was already short enough for many working families. There was also a cultural divide in how ice cream was consumed. For elites, it was a spectacle of refinement, served at balls, operas, and soirees where guests glided across parquet floors before nibbling delicately on strawberry ices. For the working class, ice cream was loud, messy, and public, bought on the street corner, eaten while dodging horse carts, soot, and pickpockets. One group worried about dripping custard onto their silk gowns, the other worried about whether their scoop contained more flies than sugar. Interestingly, the middle classes, the shopkeepers, clerks, and upwardly mobile families began to bridge the gap. They embraced ice cream parlors in the mid to late 19th century, spaces that were marketed as respectable, family-friendly alternatives to pubs. For a modest price, you could sit in a clean room, order a sundae, and feel momentarily elevated. It was democratization with whipped cream. Ice cream became a social equalizer, but only if you could afford the slightly higher price tag to avoid the risks of the street cart. In a way, ice cream reflected the contradictions of the industrial age. It was progress, an invention that delighted people across classes, but it was also peril, a dessert that could kill you faster if you were poor. The elites got sculpted castles of cream. The working poor got spoons dipped into communal bowls of bacteria. One was indulgence, the other was survival. The humor writes itself. If you were rich, ice cream was indulgence. If you were poor, it was Russian roulette without the revolver. Except in this version, the bullet was arsenic, and the chamber was your stomach. So the next time you order a triple scoop from a polished parlor with spotless counters, remember, for 19th century elites, it was an emblem of power. For the poor, it was an edible lottery ticket with the odds stacked against them, and for both it was proof that nothing, not even dessert, was ever just dessert. After centuries of playing dietary roulette with a scoop of ice cream, humanity finally decided it was time to stop turning dessert into a death sentence. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reformers, scientists, and a growing public health movement began scrubbing the grime, poison, and bacteria out of daily life. And luckily for dessert lovers everywhere, ice cream was on the list of things that needed saving. The transformation of ice cream from toxic gamble to safe indulgence didn't happen overnight. It was a slow churning process, pun fully intended. But eventually the combination of new technology, better science, and tighter regulation meant you could dig into a sundae without wondering if it would be your last. The first hero of this story is Louis Pasteur, the French scientist who gave milk, and by extension ice cream, a much-needed makeover. By the mid-1800s, people were beginning to understand that milk wasn't just spoiled by bad air or evil vapors. It was crawling with microscopic organisms that could make you violently ill. Pasteurization, The process of heating milk to kill bacteria became a public health game changer. Of course, it wasn't adopted instantly. Some critics thought heating milk would ruin its taste or even its life-giving essence. But considering the alternative, slurping down milk laced with typhoid fever or tuberculosis, it quickly caught on. By the early 20th century, pasteurization became standard in major cities, and suddenly your scoop of vanilla wasn't secretly plotting your demise. If pasteurization was the first great leap, refrigeration was the second. The ice trade of the 1800s, where giant blocks of frozen lake water were hacked out in winter and shipped around the world, was impressive, but not exactly foolproof. A stray heatwave or a sloppy delivery could ruin everything. The arrival of mechanical refrigeration changed the game. Suddenly, ice cream could be kept cold in a reliable, sanitary way. No more worrying about whether that block of ice had been dragged through a swamp before landing in your dessert. With reliable cold storage, ice cream vendors could safely stock their wares, and customers no longer needed the stomach of a goat to survive an outing to the ice cream cart. Technology helped, but the law had to step in too. The 19th century was an era when food adulteration was rampant. Flour might contain chalk, candy might contain arsenic, and ice cream, well, it could contain practically anything. Enter regulation, inspired by scandals and public outcry. Reformers pushed for stricter rules around what could and couldn't go into food. In the United States, this movement culminated in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which cracked down on adulterated ingredients. No longer could ice cream vendors freely sprinkle in a dash of formaldehyde or tint their pistachio with copper salts. Finally, there were standards and inspectors to keep dessert honest. As ice cream became safer, it also became more industrialized. Factories popped up, churning out gallons of standardized, regulated product. This mass production made ice cream cheaper, more consistent, and more widely available. By the early 20th century, ice cream parlors had gone from questionable public health hazards to wholesome family destinations. The treat was no longer just for the wealthy with ice houses or the desperate buying a penny scoop from a street cart. Ice cream was becoming truly democratic, a dessert for the masses. By the 1920s, ice cream wasn't something you whispered about after a funeral. It was something you joyfully ordered at a soda fountain. Innovations like the ice cream cone, banana split, and sundae helped cement its place as a cultural staple. Soldiers in World War II were even given ice cream to boost morale, proving that by then the treat was not only safe but also patriotic. The turnaround was astonishing. In less than a century, ice cream had gone from a potential obituary headline to a symbol of carefree indulgence. Thanks to refrigeration, pasteurization, and regulation, you could enjoy your dessert without first updating your will. Today, when you grab a pint of ice cream, the most dangerous part is probably eating the whole thing in one sitting while watching a TV series. The bloating you feel afterward, that's just dairy intolerance, not lead poisoning. And if your pistachio ice cream glows under a black light, it's because of neon sprinkles, not arsenic dye. The path to safe ice cream was bumpy, filled with spoiled milk, raw eggs, and neon-colored poisons. But by the time the 20th century hit its stride, dessert was no longer deadly. Ice cream had survived the chaos of the 1800s and emerged victorious, creamy, and safe. The best part? You can now enjoy it without fear that your death by chocolate sundae will be anything more than clever marketing. If you were alive in ancient Greece around 630 BCE, and someone asked you, who's the greatest poet alive, the answer wouldn't have been Homer, or Hesiod, or some toga-wearing guy with a fancy beard. No, the name that dropped jaws, turned heads and made hearts flutter was Sappho. Yes, Sappho of Lesbos, arguably the most celebrated female poet of antiquity, and without question one of the most influential lyricists the world has ever known. Now picture this, a time before Spotify playlists, before emo Tumblr poetry, before Shakespeare cornered the market on tragic romance. In this era, poetry wasn't just something you scribbled in a notebook and never showed anyone. Poetry was the cultural currency. It was your live performance, your social media, your TED Talk, and your best shot at impressing literally anyone, from a crush to a god. And in this world, Sappho wasn't just a participant, she was the headliner. Born around 630 BCE on the island of Lesbos, Sappho grew up in a society where women weren't exactly encouraged to dominate the cultural stage. Athens, for example, would later treat women like background furniture, necessary but not meant to speak too loudly. But Lesbos? Lesbos was different. It was a cultural hotspot with a reputation for music, poetry, and education. The perfect breeding ground for a genius with a knack for turning raw emotion into words that could melt hearts and scorch reputations. From a young age, Sappho seems to have been immersed in this lyrical world, and let's be clear, she didn't just write poetry, she weaponized it. Sappho's verses could praise, seduce, mourn, or cut sharper than a well-honed bronze sword. The fragments we have today still radiate intensity, even though most of her work has been chewed up and spat out by the passing centuries. Imagine writing so powerfully that even a fragment of a fragment, discovered centuries later on some crumbling papyrus, still manages to feel like a gut punch. That's not just talent, that's sorcery. To really understand her cultural dominance, though, we have to imagine the world she lived in. Forget cozy writing nooks and latte-fueled creativity sessions. Ancient Greek poetry was an event. Performances were live, often accompanied by a lyre, which is basically the 600 BCE version of a guitar. You didn't just read Sappho, you heard her. Her voice and music would have carried across symposia, think wine-fueled hangouts for the elite, and religious festivals. It wasn't so much a book launch as it was a concert tour. And Sappho? She was commanding, magnetic, impossible to ignore. She wasn't afraid to be personal. Her poems weren't dry epics about heroes hacking each other apart on Trojan battlefields. They were intimate, emotional, and unapologetically centered on love, desire, and longing. She zoomed in on the human heart with the precision of a surgeon, and yes, often her subject was another woman, which, for the record, was not treated with the scandalized pearl-clutching it might have gotten in other eras. The Greeks, to put it bluntly, were not shy about fluidity in love. But even so, Sappho made female desire the star of her verses, and that was revolutionary. Of course, every superstar needs a comparison, so let's put it this way. Sappho was like the Taylor Swift of ancient Greece, except instead of bad exes, her lyrical muse was literally everyone she ever admired. Where Swift might drop a line about Jake Gyllenhaal's scarf, Sappho would craft an ode to someone's dazzling smile, or the way their dress flowed in the wind. Her poetry didn't just observe beauty, it elevated it into the divine. And the reception? Let's just say people noticed. Plato, who wasn't exactly known for handing out compliments, unless you were Socrates, once referred to her as the 10th muse. For context, the original 9 muses were divine beings, literal goddesses of the arts. So basically, Plato was saying, yeah, the gods gave us 9, but Sappho is so good she deserves her own spot on Olympus. But here's the kicker. We don't actually know all that much about her personal life. The biographical scraps we have are often second-hand, sometimes contradictory, and frequently laced with rumor. Did she have a husband? Some sources say yes, others shrug. Did she write poems to her lovers? Almost certainly. But how much of that was art versus autobiography is still debated. What's undeniable is that her reputation as a poet was massive. Ancient critics ranked her alongside Homer. And let's be honest, that's like saying someone today could rap toe-to-toe with Kendrick Lamar and then switch gears to out-ballad Adele. If you strip everything else away, the rumors, the lost works, the centuries of misinterpretation, what we're left with is simple but staggering. A woman from a small island who became a global cultural icon by sheer force of her words. Her fragments echo across time with such intensity that they still move us, even when they arrive like broken text messages from the past. Sappho's story begins here, on Lesbos, a gifted voice rising in a world where poetry was power. She wasn't just another poet. She was the poet, the woman who set the bar, inspired countless others, and left a legacy so big that it made her island famous for eternity. And really, how many poets can say their hometown ended up lending its name to an entire identity? That's next-level branding. So yes, if Homer was the blockbuster director of antiquity, Sappho was the headliner at the sold-out arena tour. Her verses didn't just describe emotions, they bottled them, transformed them, and unleashed them on the world. And once you heard them, you never forgot them. When you hear the word Lesbos today, you probably think of one thing. Okay, maybe two things if you're into Mediterranean geography. But in Sappho's time, Lesbos wasn't a punchline, a stereotype, or an adjective. It was a thriving cultural hub, an island that produced music, poetry, and enough political drama to fill a season of Game of Thrones. Let's start with the basics. Lesbos is a sizable island in the northeastern Aegean Sea, tucked just off the coast of what was then Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Picture olive groves, rolling hills, clear blue waters, and a climate that made wine practically grow on trees. It wasn't some lonely rock in the sea where goats outnumbered people. This was a strategically placed, fertile and bustling island, connected by trade to both the Greek mainland and the broader Near Eastern world. Translation: Lesbos was plugged into the cultural Wi-Fi of antiquity. Its cities, Mytilene being the crown jewel, were centers of learning, music and politics. Mytilene was the kind of place where aristocrats held salons, poets competed for attention, and the latest gossip spread faster than amphorae of cheap wine. If Athens was the future tech startup of philosophy, Lesbos was the cozy yet chaotic arts district where everyone carried a lyre and a dream. And this matters, because Lesbos wasn't just scenery for Sappho's career. It was the stage, the incubator, the cultural amplifier. The island had a reputation for nurturing music and lyric poetry, thanks in part to its aristocratic families who valued artistic expression almost as much as they valued political scheming. In fact, Lesbos produced not only Sappho but also Alcaeus, another major lyric poet who specialized in mixing wine-soaked banter with political commentary. Imagine one island producing both Taylor Swift and Bob Dylan. It wasn't a bad batting average. Now let's address the olive in the amphora. How did this island become eternally linked with female same-sex love? The answer is, of course, Sappho herself. She wrote about women admiring them, desiring them, praising their beauty with a frankness that was startling then and is refreshing now. Over centuries, people began to conflate her poetry with the island itself, until lesbian meant not person from Lesbos, but woman who loves women. Here's the funny part. In Sappho's day, the word lesbian didn't mean that at all. It simply referred to a person from Lesbos. If you were a merchant from the island, you were a lesbian. If you grew olives there, you were a lesbian farmer. If you played too many drinking songs in Mytilene, congratulations, you were a rowdy lesbian bard. Nobody giggled. Nobody made knowing winks. It was geography, pure and simple. The modern meaning didn't really kick in until much, much later. Think medieval and early modern Europe, when scholars rediscovered Sappho's fragments and couldn't help but notice her intense focus on women. By the 18th and 19th centuries, lesbian had cemented itself as a sexual identity term, thanks to a cocktail of philology, moral panic, and endless reinterpretation of Sappho's work. It's one of history's greatest cases of rebranding, an entire island becoming shorthand for love between women. Now imagine being a tourist guide on Lesbos today, trying to explain this to visitors. Welcome to our beautiful island of olive oil, ouzo, and Sappho-inspired semantics. Please note, being a lesbian might simply mean you're from here, though history has complicated things. That's what happens when your hometown gets immortalized by one of the most famous poets of all time. You don't just end up on maps, you end up in dictionaries. But here's the kicker. Lesbos was already famous before Sappho. Its wine was well known across the Greek world. Its position made it a key naval power in the Archaic period. Mytilene, for example, had a reputation for both cultural sophistication and brutal political feuds. In other words, Lesbos wasn't exactly Ibiza, but it did have poetry clubs, lyres, and maybe the occasional scandal. The island combined high art with enough political intrigue to keep its citizens on their toes. This cultural richness made Sappho's rise possible. Without Lesbos's unique blend of aristocratic patronage, musical tradition, and cosmopolitan connections, Sappho might have been just another anonymous poet lost to history. Instead, she thrived in a place that valued lyricism enough to immortalize it, even if later centuries tried their best to bury her words. So what we're really seeing in Lesbos is the way a place can become inseparable from a person. Think Salzburg and Mozart, Stratford-upon-Avon and Shakespeare, or Graceland and Elvis. Except in this case, the connection runs even deeper. The island's very name became a shorthand for a category of human love and identity. That's not just legacy, that's cultural annexation of the dictionary. And it all started with a poet who lived, breathed, and sang on this island. If Sappho had been born in, say, Sparta, we'd probably have a very different story and a very different vocabulary. But she wasn't. She was from Lesbos, and the island became more than just a birthplace. It became a brand. So yes, imagine an island so culturally powerful that your vacation spot becomes shorthand for your dating life. That's Lesbos. Olive oil, wine, political intrigue, musical tradition, and a legacy so big it bent the language itself. Not bad for a patch of land floating in the Aegean. If you were a young woman in archaic Greece, your options for education were limited. Boys got to train for politics, war, and public life. Girls, well, if you were lucky, you learned how to manage a household without accidentally setting it on fire. But on the island of Lesbos there was one glittering exception to this rule: Sappho's circle, often called a thiasos. Now, a thiasos wasn't your standard school with exams, pop quizzes, and a stern headmaster who lived to crush joy. It was more like a cultural salon, part finishing school, part artistic workshop, part emotional boot camp. Sappho gathered young women from aristocratic families, possibly those preparing for marriage, and gave them something the Greek world rarely offered: a space to cultivate intellect, creativity, and emotional expression. So what did these women actually study? Poetry, music, and dance formed the backbone. These were skills not just for self-expression, but for social status. In aristocratic circles, being able to perform gracefully, sing beautifully, or compose clever verses wasn't a luxury. It was cultural currency. Sappho's thiasos gave her students the tools to shine in symposia and festivals, where performance could be the difference between being admired and being forgotten. But this wasn't just about performance polish. Her verses suggest something deeper: an education in navigating desire, longing, and emotional vulnerability. Imagine your homework assignment being, write a poem so good it makes your crush cry. Sappho's poetry often reads like an intimate conversation, almost as if it was part of a larger lesson in how to put feelings into words instead of awkwardly bottling them up. And feelings there were, oh plenty. Sappho's surviving works are dripping with emotional intimacy, many directed at her students. Were these simply exercises in praise, artistic expressions of beauty, or something more personal? That's the million drachma question. Ancient commentators, medieval scholars, and modern academics have all speculated endlessly. Some see the thiasos as a respectable finishing school with a side of musical training. Others see it as an intimate community where affection and desire between women were part of the curriculum. Here's the thing: the line between teacher, mentor, and muse wasn't clearly drawn in antiquity. Affection could be formal, poetic, or deeply personal all at once, and Sappho wasn't afraid to blur those lines in verse. To modern eyes, her words look like a love poem. To ancient audiences, they might have seen them as part of a long-standing Greek tradition of personal lyric poetry, just one that happened to center on women instead of men. Either way, the impact was the same. She gave young women a voice, and she showed them how to wield it with precision. In a society where women were usually silenced or sidelined, that was revolutionary. These weren't dusty classroom lectures about the Iliad. This was about sharpening wit, honing artistry, and embracing emotional intelligence. Sappho's school didn't produce warriors or politicians. It produced women who could command attention with a well-placed lyric. And because Sappho's poetry preserves fragments of this environment, we get a glimpse into a world that otherwise would have vanished without a trace. Most women in ancient Greece lived in obscurity. Their names, thoughts, and feelings were rarely written down, let alone preserved. But here we have echoes of laughter, friendship, admiration, longing, all caught in the amber of Sappho's verses. It's like finding a diary entry from 2,600 years ago, except the diary is written in world-class poetry. Of course, this intimacy is exactly what fueled centuries of speculation about Sappho's relationships. Was she simply praising her students as an artistic exercise, or was she expressing personal desire? Later societies, especially the prudish ones, got deeply uncomfortable with this ambiguity. Some tried to santicize her by claiming she was just a schoolmistress training girls for marriage, nothing more. Others leaned into the rumors, painting her as a love-struck figure hopelessly devoted to her pupils. The truth, as usual, is likely more complicated and far more interesting. What's undeniable is that her Theasos was a rare haven in a patriarchal world. It offered young women not just skills but also a sense of belonging, a shared space to explore art and emotion. Think of it like the world's first creative writing workshop, but with more lyres, more singing, and way more dramatic declarations of love. And really, what better way to prepare young women for the complexities of adulthood than teaching them how to channel desire, heartbreak, and joy into art? Marriage may have been waiting for many of them, but thanks to Sappho, they went into it carrying verses instead of silence. That alone was a kind of power, so if Homer gave us warriors and Hesiod gave us farmers' almanacs, Sappho gave her circle something entirely different, a space where emotions weren't a weakness, but a skill to be mastered, and her Theaisos became legendary for it. It's no wonder her circle has fascinated historians for centuries. Was it a school, a sanctuary, a salon, or something else entirely? The answer may be all of the above. What we know for sure is that for a brief window in the 7th century BCE, there was a place on Lesbos where young women could gather, sing, write, and turn their feelings into something immortal. And at the center of it all was Sappho, the teacher who made love itself into homework. When you think of ancient Greek literature, you probably imagine epics full of sword fights, heroes, and way too many descriptions of ships. But Sappho's poetry was different. She didn't bother cataloguing armies or writing instruction manuals for farming. Instead, she zoomed in on the heart, love, longing, beauty, and the messy tangle of emotions that makes humans, well, humans. If Homer was the director of action blockbusters, Sappho was the indie filmmaker who made you cry at a 2-minute short film about someone gazing at a flower. And oh, did she nail it. Sappho wrote about crushes the way modern people subtweet, short, piercing, and absolutely devastating if you happen to be the one it's about. A single line could convey the butterflies in your stomach feeling of seeing someone walk into the room, the ache of absence, or the way love can feel both divine and disastrous. She wrote about beauty not as an abstract concept, but as something immediate and personal. The curve of a smile, the sound of laughter, the shimmer of a dress. She made the ordinary incandescent. Her surviving poems also show her grappling with the gods. This wasn't the distant thunderbolt-hurling Zeus of epics. For Sappho, the divine was intimate, intertwined with desire and human vulnerability. Nowhere is this clearer than in her most famous surviving piece, the so-called Ode to Aphrodite. In it, she appeals directly to the goddess of love, asking for help in winning the affections of another woman. But instead of a stiff hymn, it reads like a deeply personal conversation. Aphrodite, please, I'm dying over here. She doesn't notice me. Could you maybe make this happen? The mix of reverence and raw honesty makes it one of the most relatable prayers in history. Who hasn't begged the universe for a little romantic intervention? And let's not underestimate the craftsmanship. Sappho pioneered new meters, rhythmic patterns of verse that carried her words like music. The famous Sapphic stanza, named after her, became a staple for later poets across centuries. In other words, she didn't just write poetry, she shaped the very rhythm of how poetry could be written. Imagine inventing a beat so catchy that other poets are still rapping over it 2 millennia later. But here's the heartbreak. Most of her poetry is gone, lost, obliterated by time, neglect, and more than a little sexism. Ancient critics once claimed there were 9 volumes of her works, neatly collected, 9 volumes. Today, we have one complete poem, a handful of nearly complete ones, and hundreds of fragments, sometimes just a single line, sometimes a single word. It's like having Shakespeare reduced to a couple of sonnets and some doodles in the margins of his shopping list. Why did this happen? Partly the usual culprits: fire, decay, the fragility of papyrus. Libraries burned, manuscripts rotted, and poetry written by women was rarely prioritized for copying and preservation. But Sappho also faced an extra hurdle. Later cultures, particularly early Christians, didn't exactly embrace her reputation for frankness about love and desire. Some even suggested her work was destroyed on purpose, seen as too immoral to preserve. In other words, the ancient cancel culture wasn't about angry tweets. It was monks deciding whether your poetry survived the Dark Ages. Spoiler, Sappho didn't make the cut. And yet, against all odds, pieces of her work trickled through, quoted in ancient grammar textbooks, preserved on scraps of papyrus dug out of Egyptian rubbish heaps, etched into memory by admirers. Imagine being so good at poetry that your scraps still go viral. 2,600 years later, that's Sappho. Modern scholars piece together her words like detectives reconstructing a shattered vase. Each fragment is a window into a world of intensity, and the fact that they still hit so hard only underscores how powerful the complete works must have been. Some fragments are tantalizingly brief. One reads simply, "Someone will remember us, I say, even in another time." That's it, no context, no explanation, just a line casually predicting her immortality. And well, she wasn't wrong. Another says, "You burn me." 2 words, and yet it manages to capture the entire roller coaster of falling for someone unattainable. Sappho had a knack for saying in one line what most poets spend volumes trying to articulate. And that's the magic of her work, its emotional immediacy. It doesn't feel like dusty ancient literature. It feels like text messages from a friend who's hopelessly smitten, or diary entries that could have been written yesterday. The details may be archaic, the lyres, the gods, the sacrificial altars, but the feelings are timeless. Of course, there's an irony here. The very fragmentary nature of her surviving work adds to her allure. Sappho isn't just a poet, she's a mystery. She forces us to imagine, to fill in the gaps, to wonder what's missing. It's like hearing one verse of a song and realizing it's the best thing you've ever heard, only to discover the rest of the record was lost centuries ago. That ache of incompleteness mirrors the longing that runs through so much of her poetry. It's as if her life and legacy became a continuation of her art. So when we talk about Sappho's poetry, we're talking about more than just words on papyrus. We're talking about a voice that refused to fade, even when history tried to silence it. A voice that made beauty divine, love universal, and heartbreak unforgettable. She wrote about crushes the way modern people subtweet. Yes, but unlike most subtweets, hers never disappeared into the void. They lingered, they survived, and they still sing. If Sappho lived today, she'd have her own TV biopic, 1 million followers, and at least 3 podcasts dissecting her love life. But in antiquity, she achieved something even rarer, genuine fame that lasted across generations. The Greeks quoted her like people quote Shakespeare today, except without the high school groaning. Her verses were sung at banquets, invoked at weddings, and written down by people who clearly thought, "This woman is too good not to copy." For a poet living around 600 BCE, this was as close to immortality as one could get. But, as with all famous figures, admiration eventually came with a side order of scandal. And in Sappho's case, the scandal wasn't necessarily what she did, but what later writers imagined she must have done. In her own time and for centuries afterward, Sappho was adored. The philosopher Plato, never one to throw around compliments, referred to her as the 10th muse. That's right, he literally upgraded the muses, those divine ladies of inspiration, just to squeeze Sappho into the lineup. Imagine being so good at your craft that you force mythology to rearrange itself. Greek anthologists preserved her verses, citing them as models of lyrical perfection. They even called her work pure, though purity here didn't mean prudishness. It meant her poetry was crystal clear in emotion and style, as sharp as a spear thrown straight into the reader's heart. But admiration is a tricky currency. While Greeks celebrated her artistry, they also turned her into a character, a larger-than-life persona who wasn't just a poet, but a symbol of passion itself. And once a person becomes a symbol, myths start sprouting like weeds. Enter the Romans. By the time Sappho's reputation sailed into their world, they did what they usually did with Greek culture: borrowed it, rebranded it, and occasionally misunderstood it. Roman poets like Ovid couldn't resist inserting Sappho into their own literary universes. Ovid, ever the dramatist, gave her a tragic backstory in his Heroides, imagining her pining after a handsome ferryman named Phaon. Here's the catch: there's no real evidence that Phaon had anything to do with Sappho's life. He was essentially a literary device, a tragic himbo invented so later audiences could nod along and say, "Ah yes, that's why she wrote all those love poems." Ovid basically turned one of the greatest lyricists in history into the star of an ancient soap opera, because heaven forbid a woman's art not be explained by her feelings for a man. Perhaps the most dramatic myth attached to Sappho was her supposed death. According to later legends, she flung herself off the Leucadian cliff, a jagged promontory in Greece, because her love for Phaon was unrequited. Cue the violins. It's the kind of ending that would make a 19th century opera director weep with joy. But historians tend to agree, it's probably nonsense. The cliff dive reads like the kind of story men in antiquity cooked up when confronted with a woman whose legacy they couldn't control. After all, what do you do with a female poet whose influence spans centuries? You write her a melodramatic exit, as though the only way her story could end was with heartbreak. Funny enough, even in her supposed death, Sappho gets mythologized into a cliché. Modern scholars roll their eyes at this, but the story stuck, lingering like an unwanted rumor at a family reunion. Fast forward a few centuries, and things only got messier. Early Christian writers, less than thrilled with a woman celebrated for passion and sensuality, began reshaping her image. To them, Sappho was dangerous, a reminder of pagan values, female desire, and artistic freedom. Naturally, the solution was to either erase her or reframe her as a cautionary tale. Her verses, once sung with lyres, were gradually suppressed. Many manuscripts vanished, and when she was mentioned, it was often with a judgmental undertone. She was depicted as too indulgent, too emotional, too scandalous. In other words, she was guilty of the unforgivable crime of being a woman with a voice. Despite this, Sappho refused to vanish completely. Her reputation survived because she was simply too good to erase. Even scraps of her poetry continued to circulate, admired despite the moral panic attached to her name. She endured the ancient equivalent of a smear campaign, outlasting both detractors and censors. In many ways, her legacy foreshadows what happens to countless women in history. When people don't know how to handle their brilliance, they either romanticize them into tragic figures or vilify them as dangerous. Sappho got both treatments and somehow managed to rise above them. Her actual superpower, outlasting centuries of men trying to explain her life better than she could herself. If Sappho were alive today, she'd be trending on social media, fighting off think pieces, and probably headlining a music festival where the ticket sales crash the website. That's how enduring her influence has been. For someone whose work survives mostly in tatters and whose life is cloaked in rumor, she somehow managed to carve a place in cultural history so deep that people still argue about her at dinner parties, academic conferences, and TikTok comment sections. Sappho's legacy isn't just about her being a great poet. It's about the way her voice traveled across centuries, refusing to be silenced, even when history tried its best to mute her. Her impact on later poets is like a chain reaction. Catullus, the Roman poet famous for his love poems, straight up borrowed from Sappho, adapting her work and sprinkling it into Latin verse as if he were remixing her greatest hits. Ovid, another Roman star, admired her so much that he imagined her as a character in his Heroides, writing a fictional letter in her voice. That's right, Ovid did fan fiction before fan fiction was cool, and centuries later, European poets, Renaissance thinkers, and romantic dreamers all reached back to Sappho's lines when they wanted to capture feelings that were too big for everyday language. It's as if she handed the world an emotional toolkit, and everyone's been borrowing her screwdriver ever since. But it wasn't just her words that lived on, it was her identity, or rather the many interpretations of it. The term sapphic eventually became shorthand for love between women. This wasn't immediate, and it didn't happen in Sappho's own time. The ancient Greeks didn't coin the word. They were too busy wrestling in gymnasiums and debating philosophy in sandals. Instead, it emerged later, when people tried to describe the kind of affection her poems expressed. Somewhere along the way, sapphic and lesbian became powerful identifiers, proving that the legacy of Sappho wasn't just poetic, but also deeply personal for those searching for language to describe their love. Imagine having your name turned into a whole category of romance that's cultural influence at its finest. Of course, Sappho's survival as a queer icon didn't come without turbulence. For centuries, her sexuality was sanitized, debated, or brushed aside by scholars who couldn't quite handle the idea that the most brilliant poet of her era might have written passionately about women. Some tried to explain it away as just friendship. Others blamed it on Greek cultural quirks. But the poems themselves refused to be boxed in. They pulse with intimacy, longing, and a rawness that still resonates. And for queer readers across history, finding Sappho's voice has often felt like stumbling across a secret ancestor who somehow knew exactly how they felt, thousands of years before pride parades existed. To this day, Sappho continues to inspire art, literature, and scholarship. Writers like Virginia Woolf, who mused about the absence of women's voices in history, found in Sappho a rare beacon from antiquity. Modern poets borrow her fragments and reimagine them, layering new meanings onto her words. And for the LGBTQ+ community, she remains a symbol of visibility, a reminder that queer desire is not a modern invention but an ancient, enduring truth. Her lines may be cracked and incomplete, but in a way that makes them more powerful. They demand participation, interpretation, and imagination. Sappho forces us not just to read her, but to fill in the silence around her, as if she left blank spaces where our own lives might fit. If she had a merch line today, it would sell out faster than a Taylor Swift tour. Hoodies with 10th Muse printed across the chest, mugs featuring her fragments in trendy fonts, limited edition vinyl where her words are read aloud over soft lyre music. She's already been immortalized on coins, statues, and countless books. Why not Etsy shops too? Her status as the 10th Muse, a title given by ancient admirers, is basically the equivalent of being added to the Marvel Avengers lineup. But instead of wielding a hammer or a shield, she wielded metaphors sharp enough to make even the gods pause. Sappho's genius is that she was never just one thing. She was a poet, a teacher, a lover, an icon, a myth, and a mystery. Her legacy doesn't live in neat categories but in the messy, overlapping spaces where art and desire collide, and perhaps that's why she still matters so much today. In a world that often tries to simplify identity, Sappho's fragments resist simplification. They whisper across millennia. Love is complex, beauty is fleeting, and words can outlast even the fiercest attempts to bury them. Sappho has passed away for over 2.5 millennia, but she still refuses to stay buried. For a poet whose work has survived in the form of burnt scraps, papyrus leftovers, and chance citations from other writers, she somehow commands a presence in the modern world that would make most contemporary celebrities jealous. And this isn't just because she was an extraordinary poet. It's because her words have proven almost indestructible, even when written on some of the most destructible materials ever invented. Modern scholarship has been busy performing a kind of poetic archaeology, piecing her voice back together from fragments. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists in Egypt discovered piles of discarded papyri in Oxyrhynchus, essentially the ancient equivalent of a giant trash dump. Among receipts, letters, and shopping lists were verses of Sappho's poetry, lines of longing, invocations to gods, and personal reflections that had somehow endured beneath centuries of sand. Imagine digging through a landfill only to find, tucked between broken pottery and fish bones, one of the greatest lyric poets of all time whispering across the centuries. That's the magic of Oxyrhynchus, a cosmic recycling project where Sappho's voice got a second chance. And yet, most of what we have is still incomplete. Sappho's surviving poetry often reads like a text message thread, where half the conversation has been deleted. We get lines like, "Someone will remember us, I say," and then nothing. It's the ancient literary equivalent of being ghosted by history. But here's the strange thing. Those broken edges, the tantalizing gaps, make her poetry even more compelling. The silences are as powerful as the words, pulling modern readers into the role of co-creator. We lean in, trying to fill the void, and in that act, Sappho's voice feels startlingly alive. Her themes remain timeless: love that overwhelms, beauty that dazzles, desire that unsettles, and moments of sharp vulnerability. These are things we recognize instantly, even if we're separated from her by centuries. She might be describing a glance from a beloved woman in archaic Greek, but the emotional punch lands as if she wrote it last Tuesday. You could put some of her fragments on Instagram today, and they'd rack up likes before anyone noticed they were older than Christianity. Her poems survived fires, censorship, and 2,600 years of gossip. Meanwhile, most of us can't keep a phone charger for more than 3 months. What's remarkable, too, is how Sappho has evolved from a poet into a symbol. Her island of Lesbos became shorthand for women-loving women. Her name became an adjective, sapphic. That's a kind of linguistic immortality few writers ever achieve. Shakespeare gave us phrases, but Sappho gave us an entire identity marker, and in doing so she became an icon, not just for scholars of antiquity, but for queer communities, artists, and anyone who has ever wanted to claim a place in the world through words. Sappho's resonance today is partly because she remains elusive. Unlike Homer, who comes down to us as a vast, bulky presence of epic proportions, Sappho is fragmented, intimate, and incomplete. She doesn't overwhelm us with volume, she lures us with glimpses. The effect is like overhearing a personal confession, rather than listening to a lecture. That intimacy keeps her fresh, even after 2,600 years of being quoted, misquoted, censored, and analyzed. Even her story has become part of the legend. The myth of her leaping from the Leucadian cliff has long been debunked, but the fact it was invented shows how deeply she unsettled later cultures. Antiquity celebrated her as the 10th muse, yet later generations tried to reshape or suppress her, and still, through all of that, she remains. Her voice not erased but scattered, waiting to be pieced back together. To read Sappho today is to step into a cosmic group chat that got deleted halfway through. You scroll through the fragments, catch a joke here, a confession there, and then hit a blank where history swiped the rest. It's frustrating, enchanting, and strangely fitting, because love, longing, and memory are always fragmentary. They never come to us whole, and that's why Sappho continues to matter. Not as a completed text, but as an open invitation to feel. If you think about it, her survival is nothing short of miraculous. Her work slipped through the cracks of time, hiding in trash heaps and neglected libraries, yet here they are. That resilience has turned her into a symbol of endurance itself. She wrote about love, and the world never stopped listening, even if most of us are just piecing together the echoes. Now, having traced Sappho from her island beginnings, her school, her poetry, her myths, and her legacy, the big question is, where do we go next? Do we follow the broader trail of women poets who came after her, often ignored but sometimes brilliant? Do we dive into how later cultures rediscovered her, from the Renaissance to the Victorians? Or do we explore how her fragments inspired not only literature, but modern music, art, and activism? Each path opens a new chapter in understanding how a woman from ancient Lesbos managed to echo into eternity. If you were to wander into a physics laboratory in the late 19th century, You might be forgiven for thinking you'd stumbled into the lair of a mad inventor rather than the birthplace of modern science. The air was thick with the smell of ozone. Strange glass contraptions hissed and sparked in the dim light, and wires coiled across tables like metal snakes waiting for their next victim. It was a time when safety goggles were a suggestion, fire extinguishers were a fantasy, and electrical shocks were more or less considered part of the job description. This was the world in which Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen lived and worked. Born in 1845, Röntgen didn't begin his career aiming to discover something that would revolutionize medicine forever. He was at heart a tinkerer, the kind of scientist who loved fiddling with strange instruments until they either broke or revealed something interesting. And in the late 1800s, there was plenty to fiddle with. Physics was buzzing with experiments involving electricity, magnetism, and light. Laboratories across Europe looked like the set of a Victorian science fiction novel. Sparks, glowing tubes, mysterious shadows, and an almost reckless joy for experimentation. At the center of much of this chaos was a particular object, the Crookes tube, named after English chemist William Crookes. This was essentially a partially evacuated glass bulb fitted with metal electrodes. When hooked up to a high-voltage source, it produced streams of mysterious cathode rays. Nobody quite knew what these rays were, but that didn't stop scientists from poking, prodding, and zapping them in every way possible. Some insisted cathode rays were particles, others claimed they were waves. All agreed, however, that they were very good at making things glow in the dark, which was apparently enough reason to keep tinkering with them. Röntgen's laboratory at the University of Würzburg in Germany was no exception. His shelves were cluttered with tubes of every shape and size, brass instruments that looked like rejected parts of a steampunk machine, and enough wiring to make a modern electrician faint. Röntgen wasn't working in complete isolation. Dozens of other scientists were also obsessed with cathode rays, but he had the kind of quiet patience and curiosity that made him stand out. Where others were happy to declare bold theories after a single spark, Röntgen preferred to sit with his experiments, watching carefully, waiting for something odd to happen, and odd things happened frequently. That was the nature of physics in the 1890s. This was before the age of controlled safety standards and carefully written research protocols. If something exploded, caught fire, or gave you a strange burn on your hand, you shrugged, wrote it down in your notebook, and tried again. Electricity was both a tool and a hazard. Wires weren't neatly coated in plastic. They were bare, eager to zap the unwary. A power surge could turn a lab into a lightning storm in miniature. Laboratories were playgrounds where danger and discovery went hand in hand. It's important to remember that Röntgen and his peers weren't deliberately chasing X-rays. They didn't even know such things existed. They were, in essence, children playing with fire. Except the fire was invisible, unpredictable, and capable of doing things nobody had imagined. The culture of science at the time encouraged this sort of boundary pushing. Physics wasn't yet a field of strict equations and quantum mechanics. It was a landscape of mystery, where even basic phenomena like electricity and magnetism were still revealing their secrets. A scientist with a good eye, a steady hand, and perhaps a reckless disregard for personal safety could genuinely stumble upon something world-changing. Röntgen himself was not a flamboyant figure. Unlike some of his contemporaries who loved dazzling lecture halls with theatrical sparks and glowing demonstrations, Röntgen was quiet, methodical, and almost painfully modest. He was the sort of man who, when he later became famous, refused to patent his discovery because he believed knowledge should belong to everyone. But in the 1890s, he was just another professor in a crowded field, laboring away in his workshop full of humming tubes and buzzing wires. Still, there was something different about his approach. Many of his colleagues treated cathode rays like a party trick. Shine them on a screen, make it glow, get a round of applause. Röntgen treated them like a riddle. Why did they behave differently in different tubes? Why did some materials glow more than others? What was actually happening inside that fragile glass chamber when electricity surged through it? His curiosity was dogged. The sort that could sit for hours staring at a faint glow on a wall and think, there's more to this. So when we say that the discovery of X-rays began with an accident, that's only half the story. Yes, a strange and unexpected glow led Röntgen down the path, but it wasn't luck alone. It was his willingness to notice the accident, to question it, and to pursue it far beyond the point where others might have shrugged and moved on. In a world of laboratories that looked more like junkyards wired to a lightning bolt, Röntgen's persistence was his real advantage. By the end of 1895, something extraordinary was waiting to be revealed. A new kind of ray, invisible but powerful, that could pass through flesh and wood, yet leave bones and metal standing out starkly. The funny part? All of it was lurking in plain sight, hiding in those humming glass tubes that had been sitting on lab benches for years. Scientists had been playing with lightning in glass tubes, without realizing they were standing inches away from a discovery that would forever change medicine, industry, and even art. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dim the lamps, close the shutters, and picture Röntgen alone in his darkened laboratory in November 1895. A man, a tube, a coil of wires, and the world about to see what no one had ever seen before. Picture it, Würzburg, November 1895. Outside, the chill of a German winter pressed against the windows, but inside Wilhelm Röntgen's laboratory, things were getting much stranger than the weather report. His desk looked less like a workplace and more like the back room of a magician's shop. Glass tubes, strange wires, humming machines, and a faint smell of ozone that made the place feel equal parts dangerous and exciting. Science in the 1890s was essentially a high-risk hobby. Electricity was the new frontier, and everyone was trying to figure out what exactly it could do. Some scientists shocked frogs' legs until they danced. Others toyed with vacuum tubes until they glowed like haunted lanterns. And Röntgen, methodical but curious, was somewhere in the middle, both precise and open to the strange. On one particular evening, Röntgen was fiddling with a Crookes tube, a glass contraption partially evacuated of air, with electrodes sealed at each end. When connected to a power source, it allowed streams of cathode rays, electrons, though they didn't know that yet, to bounce around inside like microscopic billiard balls. Normally, these rays made the tube glow, which was already spooky enough for the era. But Röntgen, ever the cautious scientist, had wrapped the whole thing in black cardboard to block the visible light. He wanted darkness. He wanted control. He wanted the experiment to behave itself. And then, the universe decided to have some fun at his expense. Across the room where no light should have been, a fluorescent screen coated with barium platinocyanide suddenly gave off a ghostly greenish glow. Now you and I might panic if the furniture started glowing for no reason, but Röntgen was a man of science, meaning his reaction was not to run but to squint harder. The glow was happening outside the tube, in a place the cathode rays should never have reached. His carefully sealed box had sprung a mystery, not a leak. Röntgen immediately suspected he was seeing something new. He turned off the current. The glow vanished. He turned it on again. The glow returned. Something invisible was escaping the tube. Something that could pass straight through the black cardboard, as if it were no more than a thin veil. Imagine being in his shoes. One moment you're tinkering with wires. The next, you're staring at proof that the world contains unseen forces flickering around you. It must have felt like finding a trapdoor in your living room that led to another dimension. But being a good scientist, he didn't just shout "Eureka" and run into the night. He experimented. He moved the screen further back, still glowing. He rotated the tube, still glowing. He tried inserting objects in between wood, books, even his notebook. The glow dimmed but persisted. Something was cutting through materials like a ghost through walls. Röntgen was methodical, but the excitement must have made his hands shake. Here was something the textbooks didn't cover, something no one had ever described. He noticed, too, that the mysterious glow was unlike the cathode rays he knew. Cathode rays needed a vacuum to travel, but this new effect passed easily through the air. Cathode rays bent with magnets, but these invisible emissions seemed indifferent to magnets entirely. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't a simple extension of the old experiments. This was something else, a new type of ray. For the next few hours, the laboratory became a stage for a ghostly light show. Röntgen moved every object within arm's reach between the tube and the glowing screen. Coins cast strange shadowy outlines. A stack of wood cut the glow only faintly. A thick book stopped it a little more, but not completely. He even tried a thin sheet of metal and watched as the rays passed through like it was gauze. Imagine the sense of discovery. A humble physicist in a provincial lab, realizing he had stumbled onto a force capable of penetrating solid matter. The discovery had all the makings of a Gothic story. A lone man in a dim laboratory, a strange green light flickering in the dark, shadows forming on a glowing surface without any visible source. If someone had written it as a novel, critics would have rolled their eyes at the melodrama. But science is often stranger than fiction. The best part? Röntgen had no idea what he was looking at. He didn't call them X-rays at first to sound mysterious. He genuinely had no clue what they were. The phys was shorthand for unknown, like the world's most famous algebra problem suddenly manifesting itself in glowing green on his lab wall. That night he could only say, something was here, something real, and it defied explanation. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how close this moment came to being overlooked. Plenty of scientists at the time were tinkering with cathode rays and vacuum tubes. Röntgen wasn't the only one, but most of them were looking for predictable patterns, familiar results. Röntgen, by contrast, noticed the unexpected, a faint green shimmer that could have easily been dismissed as a quirk of the equipment. His gift wasn't that he created the conditions for discovery. His gift was that he paid attention when the universe whispered back. In that glow, Röntgen saw a mystery begging to be solved. He didn't yet know this invisible force would soon reveal the bones of the human body, change medicine forever, and cement his name in history. For now, it was just him, his Crookes tube, and the eerie green shimmer of a discovery so strange it seemed to belong to another world. Picture it, a quiet German laboratory in late 1895, cluttered with wires, glass tubes, and the faint smell of ozone that lingered after every experiment. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen had been puzzling over his mysterious new rays for days. He knew they were real. He had seen them make a screen glow in the dark. But what could they do? Science, after all, is never satisfied with just neat party trick. The natural next step was to poke, prod, and of course stick your own body parts in front of it. So Röntgen set up his Crookes tube, the strange contraption that had been spewing out invisible radiation. He held up various objects to see what the mysterious rays would reveal. Metal coins, clear outlines, a stack of books. Some rays passed through, though faint. He grabbed a piece of wood, fuzzier. It was becoming clear that these rays were not just bouncing off surfaces like light. They were penetrating materials in ways no one had seen before. Now, most people, upon discovering invisible rays capable of piercing human flesh, might step back, take a breath, and call it a night. Röntgen did not. He leaned in closer, and as the story goes, he placed his own hand between the tube and the fluorescent screen. Imagine his astonishment as the shadowy bones of his own fingers appeared faintly on the glowing panel. That's right, without so much as a scalpel, he had peered beneath his own skin. This was not just a scientific novelty, it was a revolution waiting to happen. But Röntgen knew science needed proof, clear, undeniable, and preferably dramatic. That's where Anna Bertha, his wife, comes in. In one of the most unintentionally romantic gestures in history, Wilhelm asked her to place her hand between the mysterious rays and a photographic plate. Perhaps she agreed reluctantly, perhaps with curiosity. Accounts differ, but what emerged is now etched into scientific lore. A grainy image of her hand bones, clearly outlined against the dark background, with her wedding ring hovering like a metallic halo. This became the world's very first medical X-ray. The photograph is haunting even today. Delicate skeletal fingers, each joint visible. The ring standing out as a solid, bright band. It's part science, part Gothic artwork, and part love letter. Move over flowers and chocolates. Wilhelm gave his wife immortality through her skeleton. Valentine's Day was never the same again. Legend has it that Anna Bertha, upon seeing the ghostly picture of her own bones, exclaimed, "I have seen my death," which, let's be honest, is the exact kind of thing one blurts out when handed a supernatural-looking image in 1890. Romantic or terrifying, hard to say. Either way, her hand went down in history as the first body part to be immortalized by X-rays. But beyond the eeriness, the implications were staggering. Up until that moment, the human body had been a closed box. If you wanted to know what was wrong with someone's bones, you had two grim options: either make an educated guess or start cutting. Surgeons had to rely on outward symptoms, poking and prodding, and hoping they weren't making things worse. Broken bones, hidden bullets, internal fractures, it was guesswork at best. Röntgen had cracked open an entirely new dimension, seeing the inside of a living human without leaving a scar. News of the hand photograph spread quickly. Imagine the shock of physicians, scientists, and the general public when they realized they could look inside the body without killing the patient first. Newspapers splashed stories about the new photography across their pages. Medical schools practically salivated at the idea of peeking into their patients. And the general public? Well, they were torn between awe and paranoia. Suddenly, people worried that strangers on the street might be secretly peering at their skeletons. The idea of X-ray glasses would become a running joke for the next century. What made this moment so electric was not just the image itself, but its sheer undeniability. Science often requires piles of data and complex calculations to convince skeptics. But with X-rays, you didn't need a physics degree. You just needed to look at Anna Bertha's bony fingers. The image spoke for itself, like a window into another world. It also marked a shift in the very purpose of photography. Until then, cameras were for capturing what the eye could already see: landscapes, portraits, special occasions. Röntgen's photograph was something entirely new, a picture of the invisible. The camera had stopped being just a recording device and had become a scientific instrument. With this single picture, Röntgen had reinvented both photography and medicine. Of course, no one knew at the time what hidden dangers might accompany these rays. Radiation safety goggles, lead aprons, dosimeters. Those would come much later, after years of trial, error, and unfortunate side effects. For now, Ramin had no reason to suspect that asking his wife to stick her hand in front of the machine might be hazardous. All he saw was possibility, a chance to glimpse what had always been hidden. And so, with the bones of his wife's hand glowing on glass, Wilhelm Ramin transformed an accidental discovery into a medical revolution. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was proof, history and romance all rolled into one. He had captured a photograph that was equal parts eerie, beautiful and groundbreaking. The world would never look at hands or at the human body the same way again. What do you call something that you don't understand, can't see, and barely know exists? If you're Wilhelm Röntgen, you call it the most mathematician-sounding thing imaginable. X, that's right. X-rays owe their name to the same lazy placeholder you once scribbled in algebra class while muttering, "I'll never use this in real life," except Röntgen really did. He reached for X not out of mathematical trauma, but because these rays were, at least to him, utterly unknown. The story of naming the invisible begins in Röntgen's Würzburg lab, just days after he'd shocked the world and his wife with skeletal hand selfies. By now, word of his glowing discovery was trickling out like gossip from a medieval tavern. Something in Germany could see through flesh. Scientists across Europe perked up, and like true academics, they had one pressing question: but what do we call it? Röntgen's choice of X wasn't particularly poetic. He wasn't reaching for mystical metaphors, divine light, or even spooky labels. He simply wanted to emphasize, "I don't know what this thing is." It was as much humility as it was practicality. The naming echoed an older tradition. When scientists stumbled on something odd, they marked it with algebra's universal stand-in for the unknown. It's the same reason astronomers still talk about Planet X. Science is essentially one long group project where everyone keeps labeling their lost files final version 2. But while Röntgen leaned toward the cool anonymity of X-rays, his peers weren't all on board. Many argued these new beams should bear his name directly. Röntgen rays. It had a nice continental flair, and let's be honest, scientists loved slapping their surnames on things like proud graffiti. Ampere, ohm, joule, why not Röntgen? In fact, for decades, much of continental Europe did stick with that version. While the English-speaking world leaned on X-rays, the split wasn't just linguistic, it was almost philosophical. Was this a discovery that celebrated mystery, or one that celebrated the man who cracked it? Of course, before they worried about the name, many scientists worried about whether these rays even existed. In the 1890s, physics labs were buzzing with experiments in cathode rays, electrical discharges and glowing screens. Things sparked, fizzed and flashed all the time. For some, Röntgen's claim of invisible rays felt like just another parlor trick, akin to seance or the kind of scientific marvel you'd see at a carnival between the bearded lady and the strong man. The skepticism was fair. After all, if someone walked into your office today and claimed, "I found invisible light that sees your bones," you'd probably check their coffee cup for suspicious substances. Röntgen had to back up his bold claim with meticulous evidence. His published paper in late 1895 wasn't just stuffed with flowery prose, it had photographs, hard proof. Nothing shuts up a skeptical academic like a picture of a hand where you can count each knuckle and see a wedding band hovering in the middle, like an ominous loop of doom. Within weeks, labs across Europe scrambled to replicate his experiments. Some succeeded spectacularly, producing eerie images of coins inside purses, bullets lodged in limbs, or frog skeletons staring back at them like nature's own cartoon. Others, less skilled or simply unlucky, ended up with disappointing blurs, leading them to mutter that maybe Röntgen had staged the whole affair. One French physicist even sniffed that it was too photographic to be real, to which Röntgen probably would have replied, "Yes, that's the point." Once the existence of X-rays was undeniable, the race was on, not just to explore what they could do, but to claim them. Some wanted the name to honor the discoverer. Others argued the term should describe the property of the rays themselves, though no one really knew what that property was. Invisible lightning beams, shadow light. Let's face it, most alternatives sounded either terrifying or like bad fantasy novels. Röntgen's X had an elegance to it, mysterious yet scientific, broad enough to survive the ages. Still, Röntgen rays stubbornly clung on, especially in Germany, Austria and parts of Eastern Europe. Hospitals in Vienna would advertise Röntgen examinations. Textbooks in Russia spoke reverently of Röntgen beams. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, X-rays fit nicely with the era's obsession with the exotic unknown. Victorians loved a good mystery, especially one that could be photographed and framed above the fireplace. The naming debate even spilled into popular culture. Newspapers trumpeted the discovery as if Röntgen had unveiled a new sense of sight, calling it everything from shadow vision to photography of the unseen. The public, less concerned with precision, was enthralled. X-rays, Röntgen rays didn't matter. The important part was that humanity suddenly had a flashlight into the hidden architecture of life itself. For Röntgen, the name X-rays reflected his personal preference for understatement. He wasn't the type to push for eternal fame through branding. In fact, he later refused to patent his discovery, believing it belonged to science, not his bank account. It's ironic, then, that despite his modesty, the word Röntgen still gets tacked onto the technology across much of Europe. He didn't demand the legacy, but the world gave it to him anyway. Perhaps the most fitting part of the story is that the name X-rays has stuck globally, not because we solved the mystery, but because it captures the ongoing sense of the unknown. Even today, we don't fully understand all the subtleties of how high-energy photons interact with matter. In other words, Röntgen's placeholder was more accurate than anyone realized. The X never really went away. The world of the 1890s was captivated not just by what these rays could do, but by the idea that there were invisible forces surrounding us, waiting to be unveiled. Calling them X-rays preserved that mystery, that sense of wonder. It was a reminder that sometimes science advances not with certainty, but with the humility to say, "We don't know yet." And so, thanks to one cautious German physicist and his stubborn algebraic instinct, The unknown got a name, not flashy, not poetic, but perfect. Because really, what else could you call a discovery that literally revealed the hidden bones beneath your skin, except the letter that means mystery itself? If you ever thought social media trends spread fast, wait until you hear about the cultural hurricane that was X-rays within months. X-rays weren't just in physics labs, they were in newspapers, traveling shows, and even amusement parks. Imagine waking up in January 1896, sipping your morning coffee, and opening the paper to see a photograph not of someone's face but of their hand bones. Skeletal selfies became a media obsession. One Parisian journal described it as photography with vision beyond nature, while American newspapers churned out stories that sounded suspiciously like tabloid headlines. Woman finds needle in foot thanks to magic rays, or skeletons stalk the streets of London. The public was hooked. The X-ray wasn't just science, it was spectacle. Medical doctors were among the first to leap on board, but so were showmen. Carnival barkers quickly realized that nothing drew a crowd like seeing your bones projected in ghostly clarity. Traveling fairs set up booths where, for a small fee, you could thrust your hand into a machine and walk away with your very own skeletal portrait. It was the Victorian equivalent of a Polaroid booth, but with more existential crisis. Imagine couples holding hands in line, giggling nervously, then getting prints that showed not tender fingers intertwined, but skeletal claws reaching for one another. Romantic, perhaps? Nightmare fuel? Absolutely. Entrepreneurs also spotted dollar signs. Suddenly, X-ray-proof fashions hit the market. Ads boasted of lead-lined underwear for ladies who didn't wish their modesty to be violated by wandering rays. Some worried that nefarious men might smuggle X-ray glasses into theaters to see beneath skirts. Of course, no one actually had handheld X-ray goggles, but that didn't stop the rumors or the panicked sales of protective garments. It was as if the 1890s discovered both science and paranoia in one fell swoop. Meanwhile, doctors were scrambling to test X-rays on everything from locating bullets in soldiers to diagnosing bone fractures. In an age when surgery was still perilous and messy, the idea of peering inside the body without a single incision felt miraculous. The Lancet, Britain's prestigious medical journal, reported cases of X-rays successfully identifying swallowed objects, like coins. Parents everywhere probably sighed in relief. At last, a way to confirm whether little Timmy's lunch really included his toy soldier. But the craze wasn't confined to hospitals or science halls. Department stores in major cities installed X-ray machines as novelties for curious shoppers. You could try on a pair of gloves and then immediately see your skeletonized hand modeling them. Think of it as early augmented reality, but instead of making you look like a cat on Instagram, it made you look like you'd already been buried 6 feet under. The artistic community also jumped in, blending science with symbolism. Painters and illustrators marveled at the way X-rays dissolved the boundary between inside and outside, between appearance and truth. Magazines printed satirical cartoons showing politicians as skeletons, suggesting that the rays could strip away deceit as easily as flesh. Satire met science in a way that made the X-ray not only a medical marvel but a cultural mirror. Of course, where there's novelty, there's also fear. Some religious leaders fretted that X-rays might intrude on the sanctity of the soul. If man could now see through flesh, what was next? Could scientists peer into the spirit itself? Sermons warned of mankind's hubris, while more imaginative critics suggested that X-rays might awaken dangerous curiosities best left untouched. After all, once you see your bones, you can't unsee them. There was also a distinctly Gothic thrill to the phenomenon. The 1890s were already obsessed with spiritualism, seance, and ghost photography. X-rays fit neatly into this world. They offered a scientific way to see the invisible, but with the eerie vibe of summoning the dead. Victorian audiences who once paid to watch mediums conjure spirits were now lining up to watch their own skeletons flicker on screens. It was macabre, yet mesmerizing. The craze was not just limited to Europe. In America, newspapers and medical societies spread the news like wildfire. One headline breathlessly proclaimed, The new photography, see your own bones. Within months of Röntgen's announcement, the X-ray had crossed oceans, languages, and professional boundaries. By the end of 1896, it was being used by surgeons, toyed with by carnival operators, and debated by philosophers. Few discoveries in history have made such an immediate leap from laboratory bench to living room conversation. It's worth pausing to appreciate the speed of it all. Romantigan discovered the rays in late 1895. By spring of 1896, the entire world was talking about them, experimenting with them, and sometimes abusing them. In the age before social media, before even reliable transatlantic telegraph cables, the X-ray became viral, proof that nothing spreads faster than a mix of wonder and fear. The X-ray craze wasn't just about bones then, it was about possibility, spectacle, and the irresistible lure of the unseen. For Victorians, accustomed to mysteries of the night sky, hidden microbes and electrical wonders, the X-ray felt like a key to a door they never knew existed. And while the door led to both science and superstition, one thing was certain: the world would never look at itself in quite the same way again. At first, X-rays seemed like the best thing since sliced bread. Except, unlike sliced bread, they could actually cut through you without even trying. When Wilhelm Röntgen unveiled his invisible discovery, the world marveled at its power, but didn't bother to ask the most basic question: is it safe to stand in front of this mysterious radiation cannon for hours on end? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. In the late 1890s, safety precautions in science looked something like this. Step 1. Roll up your sleeves. Step 2. Maybe don't inhale the smoke directly. Step 3. If it glows and crackles, poke it harder. Laboratory safety manuals didn't exist. Lab coats were more fashion than function, and words like protective shielding might as well have been written in Martian. Into this anything-goes environment came X-rays, and people rushed to play with them as if they were toys rather than a completely new form of invisible energy. It didn't take long before the glow of excitement started to come with a painful itch. Early experimenters began to notice their skin reddening after long exposures to X-rays, not unlike a really aggressive sunburn. At first, this was considered a curious side effect, the kind of minor discomfort one shrugged off in the name of science. After all, science in the 19th century already involved frequent explosions, occasional electrocution, and the odd poisoning. What's a little skin irritation in the grand pursuit of knowledge? But things escalated. Burns deepened, skin blistered, hair fell out in patches. Some unlucky pioneers even lost fingers to necrosis after repeated exposures. The invisible rays that made bones glow so beautifully on photographic plates were also cooking flesh in real time. If anyone had invented a Geiger counter back then, it would have screamed in horror. One of the most tragic and ultimately influential stories came from Thomas Edison's laboratory. Edison, never one to miss out on a scientific trend, dove headfirst into X-ray experimentation. He developed a fluoroscope, a device that allowed continuous X-ray viewing in real time. Unfortunately, his chief assistant Clarence Daly bore the brunt of the testing. Daly spent countless hours exposing his hands and body to X-rays, convinced they were harmless. By 1900, his hands were riddled with ulcers. Doctors amputated fingers, then hands, then arms, but the damage was unstoppable. In 1904, Clarence Daly became the first known fatality of radiation exposure. Edison, shaken by the death, swore off X-ray research entirely, famously declaring, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I am afraid of them." It was a rare moment when the Wizard of Menlo Park admitted defeat, not to a rival inventor but to an invisible enemy he couldn't outsmart. What's striking is how slow the medical community was to take these warning signs seriously. Many doctors continued to use X-rays liberally, sometimes blasting patients with exposures lasting half an hour or more. They marveled at their ability to see tuberculosis lesions or fractured bones, while ignoring the fact that their patients were walking away with burns that made them look like they'd tried to sunbathe on mercury. Some even thought the burns were a feature rather than a bug. A number of physicians proposed using X-rays as a treatment for skin conditions, acne, or unwanted hair. In some cases, the hair did fall out, just usually along with layers of skin. Radiation therapy would eventually find a legitimate medical place, but in these early days it was trial and error, with far more error than anyone should have accepted. By the first decade of the 20th century, evidence piled too high to ignore. Reports of severe injuries and deaths circulated in medical journals, newspapers, and scientific meetings. The honeymoon period was officially over. Scientists realized that X-rays were not some magical, harmless window into the body. They were a form of energy with real, dangerous biological effects. Protective measures began creeping in. Experimenters started to use lead shields to block stray radiation, gloves to protect their hands, and shorter exposure times for patients. Hospitals began designing dedicated X-ray rooms with lead-lined walls to contain the invisible menace. It was the start of radiation safety protocols that would become standard in the 20th century, though they were often ignored in the early years by enthusiastic showmen who thought glowing bones were too much fun to ruin with caution. Looking back, the most chilling aspect of the early X-ray craze isn't just the burns and amputations, but the utter lack of understanding about long-term effects. Nobody at the time had a clue about radiation-induced cancers. For many early experimenters, the consequences didn't appear until years later, when aggressive tumors developed in the very spots most often exposed. These cases tragically provided more evidence for just how dangerous prolonged contact could be. If the 1890s had been a carnival of curiosity, the 1910s brought the sobering realization that every carnival ride comes with a price, and this one was paid in flesh and bone. It's easy now to mock the reckless abandon with which scientists and doctors bathed themselves in X-rays, but their sacrifice, whether willing or not, taught the world crucial lessons about invisible dangers. They revealed that science's wonders often arrive hand in hand with risks, and that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the mistakes that burn us, literally. By the time radiation safety became a serious field of study, the damage had already been done to a generation of pioneers. Their scars, amputations, and illnesses became cautionary markers that shaped future protocols. It's a grim irony. The same rays that could show us hidden fractures also fractured the lives of those who worked with them too eagerly. So, while we might admire the bravery or the sheer obliviousness of the first wave of X-ray adventurers, we also owe them a reluctant thank you. Their suffering paved the way for safety standards that allow us to use X-rays today, without leaving the hospital glowing like a light bulb. It's one thing to discover a new scientific curiosity. It's another to stumble into a technology so transformative that it permanently rewrites medicine, science, and even how people imagine the body itself. When Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen noticed that eerie glow back in 1895, he couldn't have predicted that his accident-prone laboratory would spark a revolution. Yet within a generation, X-rays became not just a party trick or a carnival booth gimmick, but a cornerstone of modern civilization. Let's start with the most obvious beneficiary, medicine. Before X-rays, diagnosing a broken bone meant two things. One, poking the injured area while the patient screamed, and two, making an educated guess. Surgeons often had to open up the body just to see what was going on inside, which carried all the risks of infection, blood loss, and a patient who might not stick around to thank them afterward. X-rays turned this on its head. Suddenly, a doctor could peer inside without cutting anything open. Broken femur? There it is. A swallowed coin? Yep, lodged right there. That toothache? Ah, a rotten molar revealed in perfect shadow. Within just a few years of their discovery, X-rays saved countless lives, reduced surgical guesswork, and gave patients the luxury of not having exploratory incisions made just for curiosity's sake. But the magic of X-rays didn't stop with bones. The invisible rays proved to be Swiss Army knives of science. Chemists realized they could use them to study the arrangement of atoms in crystals. Crystallography was born, leading eventually to discoveries like the double helix structure of DNA. Think about that, the very same rays that once made people gasp at carnival skeleton portraits also unveiled the code of life itself. Röntgen's curiosity laid the groundwork for fields he couldn't have dreamed of, fields where Nobel Prizes sprouted like mushrooms. Then there's the world of technology. Fast forward to the 20th century, X-rays became essential in engineering, letting inspectors detect cracks in airplane wings, flaws in pipelines, or weaknesses in skyscraper beams, all without dismantling a thing. By the time airports came into the picture, X-rays were redeployed again, this time not for bones or crystals but for catching would-be smugglers. The same rays that once astonished Victorian crowds now casually reveal hidden pocket knives in carry-on bags. You may roll your eyes at airport security, but without X-rays your suitcase would be unpacked, sock by sock. Art, too, got its invisible makeover. Historians discovered they could use X-rays to peek beneath centuries-old paintings, hidden brushstrokes, abandoned sketches, and even completely different works lay under the surface. X-rays exposed forgeries, revealed forgotten masterpieces, and let us see the draft versions of geniuses like Rembrandt and Picasso. Imagine the thrill of peeling back the Mona Lisa's polite smile, only to find Leonardo doodling practice noses underneath. Thanks to Röntgen, art history gained its own kind of time machine. But perhaps the greatest legacy of X-rays is cultural. They changed how people thought about the body itself. For centuries, flesh was a mystery. Bones were macabre symbols locked away in catacombs, and seeing inside belonged to surgeons and gravediggers. X-rays democratized the skeleton. Suddenly, ordinary people could see themselves as walking frameworks of bone and metal fillings. It was a kind of forced existential moment. You weren't just you were a skeleton wearing a meat suit. No wonder early 20th century humor and advertisements ran wild with the imagery. Of course, the legacy wasn't all playful. The darker side of radiation loomed large in the 20th century. As the medical world embraced X-rays, the physics community marched further into the atom, eventually unleashing nuclear weapons. While Röntgen himself never pursued atomic physics, his discovery lit the fuse on a century obsessed with invisible forces, both miraculous and terrifying. The same rays that healed could also harm, and that paradox shaped how society handled science from then on, with awe, caution, and the occasional lead apron. For Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, the personal legacy was surprisingly humble. He never patented X-rays, never cashed in on the craze. Instead, he published his findings openly, ensuring the world could build upon them freely. In 1901, he received the very first Nobel Prize in physics, not because he chased fame, but because his work embodied the essence of science. Curiosity rewarded by accident turned into progress. Röntgen himself stayed modest, insisting that he hadn't discovered anything new, only noticed what nature had hidden in plain sight. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine a world without X-rays. We take them for granted the way we do electricity or indoor plumbing. They're part of routine medical checkups, security protocols, and entire branches of science, all from a flicker of light in a darkened lab. Röntgen didn't just open a door, he knocked down the walls, revealing that the invisible could be made visible, the unknowable mapped, the hidden revealed. The irony, of course, is that Röntgen never wanted the rays named after him. He preferred X for unknown, yet his own name became permanently welded to the phenomenon in many countries. It's a fitting reminder that even when we try to stay in the shadows, the light of discovery tends to shine right through us. So, did Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen cure something big? No, but he gave doctors, scientists, and even artists a new way to look it in the face. And for a man tinkering with a broken vacuum tube in a messy lab, that's not a bad legacy to leave behind.